It is often said that the first sound we hear in the womb is our mother's heartbeat. Actually, the first sound to vibrate our newly developed hearing apparatus is the pulse of our mother's blood through her veins and arteries. We vibrate to that primordial rhythm even before we have ears to hear. Before we were conceived, we existed in part as an egg in our mother's ovary. All the eggs a woman will ever carry form in her ovaries while she is a 4-month-old fetus in the womb of her mother. This means our cellular life as an egg begins in the womb of our grandmother. Each of us spent 5 months in our grandmother's womb, and she in turn formed within the womb of her grandmother. We vibrate to the rhythms of our mother's blood before she herself is born. Lane Redmond, When the Drummers Were Women. Your house glows at night like everything inside is on fire. The drapes she chose for the windows look like linen. Expensive linen. The weave is loose enough that I can usually read your mood. I can watch the girl flip her ponytail while she finishes homework. I can watch the little boy toss tennis balls at the 12-foot ceiling while your wife lunges around the living room in leggings, reversing the day's mess. Toys back in the basket. Pillows back on the couch. Tonight, though, you've left the drapes open. Maybe to see the snow falling. Maybe so your daughter could look for reindeer. She's long stopped believing, but she will pretend for you. Anything for you. You've all dressed up. The children are in matching plaid, sitting on the leather ottoman as your wife takes their picture with her phone. The girl is holding the boy's hand. You're fiddling with the record player at the back of the room and your wife is speaking to you, but you hold up a finger, you've almost got it. The girl jumps up and your wife, she sweeps up the boy, and they spin. You lift a drink, scotch, and sip it once, twice, and slink from the record like it's a sleeping baby. That's how you always start to dance. You take him. He throws his head back. You tip him upside down. Your daughter reaches up for daddy's kiss and your wife holds your drink for you. She sways over to the tree and adjusts a string of lights that isn't sitting quite right. And then you all stop and lean toward one another and shout something in unison, some word, perfectly timed, and then you all move again. This is a song you know well. Your wife slips out of the room and her son's face follows robotically. I remember that feeling. Of being the needed one. Matches. She comes back to light the candles on the decorated mantel and I wonder if the snaking fir boughs are real, if they smell like the tree farm. I let myself imagine, for a moment, watching those boughs go up in flames while you all sleep tonight. I imagine the warm, butter yellow glow of your house turning to a hot, crackling red. The boy has picked up an iron poker and the girl gently takes it away before you or your wife notices. The good sister. The helper. The protector. I don't normally watch for this long, but you're all so beautiful tonight and I can't bring myself to leave. The snow, the kind that sticks, the kind she'll roll into snowmen in the morning to please her little brother. I turn on my wipers, adjust the heat, and notice the clock change from 7:29 to 7:30. This is when you'd have read her the Polar Express. Your wife, she's in the chair now, and she's watching the three of you bounce around the room. She laughs and collects her long, loose curls to the side. She smells your drink and puts it down. She smiles. Your back is to her so you can't see what I can, that she's holding her stomach with one hand, that she rubs herself ever so slightly and then looks down, that she's lost in the thought of what's growing inside her. They are cells. But they are everything. You turn around and her attention is pulled back to the room. To the people she loves. She will tell you tomorrow morning. I still know her so well. I down to put on my gloves. When I look back up, the girl is standing at your open front door. Her face is half lit by the lantern above your house number. The plate she's holding is stacked with carrots and cookies. You'll leave crumbs on the tile floor of the foyer. You'll play along and so will she. Now she's looking at me sitting in my car. She shivers. The dress your wife bought her is too small and I can see that her hips are growing, that her chest is blooming. With one hand she carefully pulls her ponytail over her shoulder, and it's more the gesture of a woman than a girl. For the first time in her life I think our daughter looks like me. I put down the car window and I lift my hand, a hello, a secret hello. She places the plate at her feet and stands again to look at me before she turns around to go inside. To her family. I watch for the drapes to be yanked closed, for you to come to the door to see why the hell I am parked outside your home on a night like tonight. And what, really, could I say? I was lonely. I missed her. I deserved to be the mother inside your glowing house. Instead she prances back into the living room, where you've coaxed your wife from the chair. While you dance together, close, feeling up the back of her shirt, our daughter takes the boy's hand and leads him to the center of the living room window. An actor hitting her mark on the stage. They were framed so precisely. He looks just like Sam. He has his eyes. And that wave of dark hair that ends in a curl, the curl I wrapped around my finger over and over again. I feel sick. Our daughter is staring out the window looking at me, her hands on your son's shoulders. She bends down and kisses him on the cheek. And then again. And then again. The boy likes the affection. He is used to it. He is pointing to the falling snow, but she won't look away from me. She rubs the tops of his arms as though she's warming him up. Like a mother would do. You come to the window and kneel down to the boy's level. You look out and then you look up. My car doesn't catch your eye. You point to the snowflakes like your son, and you trace a path across the sky with your finger. You're talking about the sleigh. About the reindeer. He's searching the night, trying to see what you see. You flick him playfully under the chin. Her eyes are still fixed on me. I find myself sitting back in my seat. I swallow and finally look away from her. She always wins. When I look back, she's still there, watching my car. I think she might reach for the curtain, but she doesn't. My eyes don't leave her this time. I pick up the thick stack of paper beside me on the passenger seat and feel the weight of my words. I've come here to give this to you. This is my side of the story. Chapter 1. You slid your chair over and tapped my textbook with the end of your pencil, and I stared at the page, hesitant to look up. Hello? I had answered you like a phone call. This made you laugh. And so we sat there, giggling, two strangers in a school library, studying for the same elective subject. There must have been hundreds of students in the class. I had never seen you before. The curls in your hair fell over your eyes and you twirled them with your pencil. You had such a peculiar name. You walked me home later in the afternoon and we were quiet with each other. You didn't hide how smitten you were, smiling right at me every so often. I looked away each time. I had never experienced attention like that from anyone before. You kissed my hand outside my dorm and this made us laugh all over again. Soon we were 21 and we were inseparable. We had less than a year left until we graduated. We spent it sleeping together in my raft of a dorm bed, and studying at opposite ends of the couch with our legs intertwined. We'd go out to the bar with your friends, but we always ended up home early, in bed, in the novelty of each other's warmth. I barely drank, and you'd had enough of the party scene. You wanted only me. Nobody in my world seemed to mind much. I had a small circle of friends who were more like acquaintances. I was so focused on maintaining my grades for my scholarship that I didn't have the time or the interest for a typical college social life. I suppose I hadn't grown very close to anyone in those years, not until I met you. You offered me something different. We slipped out of the social orbit and were happily all each other needed. The comfort I found in you was consuming. I had nothing when I met you, and so you effortlessly became my everything. This didn't mean you weren't worthy of it. You were. You were gentle and thoughtful and supportive. You were the first person I'd told that I wanted to be a writer, and you replied, I can't imagine you being anyone else. I reveled in the way girls looked at us, like they had something to be jealous about. I smelled your head of waxy dark hair while you slept at night and traced the line of your fuzzy jaw to up in the morning. You were an addiction. For my birthday, you wrote down 100 things you loved about me. 14. I love that you snore a little bit right when you fall asleep. 27. I love the beautiful way you write. 39. I love tracing my name on your back. 59. I love sharing a muffin with you on the way to class. 72. I love the mood you wake up in on Sundays. 80. I love watching you finish a good book and then hold it to your chest at the end. 92. I love what a good mother you'll be one day. Why do you think I'll be a good mother? I put down the list and felt for a moment like maybe you didn't know me at all. Why wouldn't you be a good mother? You poked me playfully in the belly. You're caring. And sweet. I can't wait to have little babies with you. There was nothing to do but force myself to smile. I'd never met someone with a heart as eager as yours. One day you'll understand, Blythe. The women in this family, we're different. I can still see my mother's tangerine lipstick on the cigarette filter. The ash falling into the cup, swimming in the last sip of my orange juice. The smell of my burnt toast. You asked about my mother, Cecilia, only on a few occasions. I told you only the facts. 1. She left when I was 11 years old. 2. I only ever saw her twice after that. And 3. I had no idea where she was. You knew I was holding back more, but you never pressed. You were scared of what you might hear. I understood. We're all entitled to have certain expectations of each other and of ourselves. Motherhood is no different. We all expect to have, and to marry, and to be, good mothers. 1939 to 1958. Etta was born on the very same day World War II began. She had eyes like the Atlantic Ocean and was red-faced and pudgy from the beginning. She fell in love with the first boy she ever met, the town doctor's son. His name was Louis, and he was polite and well-spoken, not common among the boys she knew, and he wasn't the type to care that Etta hadn't been born with the luck of good looks. Louis walked Etta to school with one hand behind his back, from their very first day of school to their last. And Etta was charmed by things like that. Her family owned hundreds of acres of cornfields. When Etta turned 18 and told her father she wanted to marry Louis, he insisted his new son-in-law had to learn how to farm. He had no sons of his own, and he wanted Louis to take over the family business. But Etta thought her father just wanted to prove a point to the young man. Farming was hard and respectable work. It wasn't for the weak. And it certainly wasn't for an intellectual. Etta had chosen someone who was nothing like her father. Louis had planned to be a doctor like his own father was, and had a scholarship waiting for medical school. But he wanted Etta's hand in marriage more than he wanted a medical license. Despite Etta's pleas to take it easy on him, her father worked Louis to the bone. He was up at 4 o'clock every morning and out into the dewy fields. For in the morning until dusk, and as Etta liked to remind people, he never complained once. Louis sold the medical bag and textbooks that his own father had passed down to him, and he put the money in a jar on their kitchen counter. He told Etta it was the start of a college fund for their future children. Etta thought this said a lot about the selfless kind of man he was. One fall day, before the sun rose, Louis was severed by the beater on a silage wagon. He bled to death, alone in the cornfield. Etta's father found him and sent her to cover up the body with a top from the barn. She carried Louis's mangled leg back to the farmhouse and threw it at her father's head while he was filling a bucket of water meant to wash away the blood on the wagon. She hadn't told her family yet about the child growing inside her. She was a big woman, 70 pounds overweight, and hid the pregnancy well. The baby girl, Cecilia, was born 4 months later on the kitchen floor in the middle of a snowstorm. Etta stared at the jar of money on the counter above her while she pushed the baby out. Etta and Cecilia lived quietly at the farmhouse and rarely ventured into town. When they did, it wasn't hard to hear everyone's whispers about the woman who suffered from the nerves. In those days, not much more was said, not much more was suspected. Louis's father gave Etta's mother a regular supply of sedatives to give to Etta as she saw fit. And so Etta spent most days in the small brass bed in the room she grew up in, and her mother took care of Cecilia. But Etta soon realized she would never meet another man lying doped up like that in bed. She learned to function well enough and eventually started to take care of Cecilia, pushing her around town in the stroller while the poor girl screamed for her grandmother. Etta told people she'd been plagued with a terrible chronic stomach pain, that she couldn't eat for months on end, and that's how she'd got so thin. Nobody believed this, but Etta didn't care about their lazy gossip. She had just met Henry. Henry was new to town and they went to the same church. He managed a staff of 60 people at a candy manufacturing plant. He was sweet to Etta from the minute they met. He loved babies and Cecilia was particularly cute, so she turned out not to be the problem everyone said she'd be. Before long, Henry bought them a Tudor-style house with mint green trim in the middle of town. Etta left the brass bed for good and gained back all the weight she'd lost. She threw herself into making a home for her family. There was a well-built porch with a swing, lace curtains on every window, and chocolate chip cookies always in the oven. One day their new living room furniture was delivered to the wrong house, and the neighbor let the delivery man set it all up in her basement even though she hadn't ordered it. When Etta caught wind of this, she ran down the street after the truck, yelling profanity in her housecoat and curlers. This gave everyone a good laugh, including, eventually, Etta. She tried very hard to be the woman she was expected to be. A good wife. A good mother. Everything seemed like it would be just fine. Chapter 2. Things that come to mind when I think about the beginning of us. Your mother and father. This might not have been as important to other people, but with you came a family. My only family. The generous gifts, the airplane tickets to be with you all somewhere sunny on vacation. Their house smelled like warm, laundered linens, always, and I never wanted to leave when we visited. The way your mother touched the ends of my hair made me want to crawl onto her lap. Sometimes it felt like she loved me as much as she loved you. Their unquestioning acceptance about where my father was, and the lack of judgment when he declined their invitation to visit for the holidays, was a kindness I was grateful for. Cecilia, of course, was never discussed. You'd thoughtfully prefaced this with them before you brought me home. Blythe is wonderful. She really is. But just so you know, my mother wouldn't have been someone you gossiped about among yourselves. None of you had an appetite for anything but the pleasant. You were all so perfect. You called your little sister darling and she adored you. You phoned home every night and I would listen from the hallway, wishing I could hear what your mother said that made you laugh like you did. You went home every other weekend to help your dad around the house. You hugged. You babysat your small cousins. You knew your mother's banana bread recipe. You gave your parents a card every year on their anniversary. My parents had never even mentioned their wedding. My father. He didn't return my message informing him I wouldn't be home for Thanksgiving that year, but I lied to you and said he was happy I'd met someone, and that he sends his best wishes to your family. The truth was we hadn't spoken much since you and I met. We'd communicated mostly through our answering machines, and even then it had become a series of stale, generic exchanges that I would have been embarrassed for you to hear. I'm still not sure how we got there, he and I. The lie was necessary, like the scattering of other lies I told so that you didn't suspect just how fucked up my family was. Family was too important to you. Neither of us could risk how the whole truth about mine might change the way you saw me. That first apartment. I loved you the most there when it was morning. The way you pulled the sheet over you like a hood and slept some more, the thick boyish smell you left on our pillowcases. I was waking up early then, before the sun most of the time, to write at the end of the galley kitchen that was always so damn cold. I wore your bathrobe and drank tea from a ceramic cup I'd painted for you at one of those pottery places. You'd call my name later on, when the floors had warmed and the light from behind the blinds was enough for you to see the details of my flesh. You'd pull me back in and we'd experiment. You were bold and assertive and understood what my body was capable of before I was. You fascinated me. Your confidence. Your patience. The primal need you had for me. Nights with Grace. She was the one friend from college I stayed in touch with after we graduated. I didn't let on how much I liked her because you seemed a bit jealous of her time with me and thought we drank too much, although I gave her very little as far as female friendships go. But still, you gave us both flowers on Valentine's Day the year she was single. I invited her to dinner once a month or so, and you'd sit as our third on the garbage pail flipped upside down. You'd always stop for the good bottle of wine on your way home from work. When the gossip took over, when she brought out the cigarettes, you'd excuse yourself politely and open a book. One night we heard you speaking to your sister on the balcony while we smoked inside. Imagine. She was going through a breakup and she had called her brother, her confidant. Grace asked me what was wrong with you. Bad in bed? Temper? There had to be something because no man was this perfect. But there wasn't. Not then. Not that I understood. I used the word luck. I was lucky. I didn't have much, but I had you. Our work. We didn't speak about it often. I envied your rising success and you knew it. You were sensitive to the differences in our careers, our incomes. You were making money and I was dreaming. I had made next to nothing since graduating, except from a few small freelance projects, but you supported us generously and gave me a credit card, saying only, use it for whatever you need. By then you'd been hired at the architecture firm and promoted twice in the time it took me to write 3 short stories. Unpublished ones. You would leave for work looking like you belonged to someone else. My rejection letters came in like they were supposed to. This was part of the process, you reminded me, kindly and often. It'll happen. Your unconditional belief in me felt magical. I desperately wanted to prove to myself that I was as good as you thought I was. Read to me. Whatever you wrote today. Please. I always made you beg and then you'd chuckle when I feigned exasperation and agreed. Our silly routine. You'd curl up on the couch after dinner, exhausted, your office clothes still on. You would close your eyes while I read you my work and you would smile at all of my best lines. The night I showed you my first published story, your hand shook as you took the Heatherstock magazine. I've thought of that often. That pride you had in me. I would see that shaking hand again years later, holding her tiny wet head, marked with my blood. But before then, you asked me to marry you on my 25th birthday. With a ring I sometimes still wear on my left hand. Chapter 3. I never asked you if I was. I bought it used because I saw it in the window of a vintage store and couldn't get it out of my mind while I browsed the expensive boutiques with your mother. You never whispered, as some Audrains do, sweating at the altar and rocking on their feet, you look beautiful. You never mentioned my dress when we hid behind the red brick wall at the back of the property, waiting to float into the courtyard where our guests drank champagne and talked about the heat and wondered when the next canapé would pass. You could barely look away from my shining pink face. You could barely let go of my eyes. You were the most handsome you had ever been, and I can close my eyes now and see 26-year-old you, the way your skin looked bright and your hair still curled down around your forehead. I swear you had remnants of baby fat in your cheeks. We squeezed each other's hands all night. We knew so little then about each other, about the people we would be. We would have counted our problems on the petals of the daisy in my bouquet, but it wouldn't be long before we were lost in a field of them. There will be no table for the family of the bride, I had overheard the wedding planner say in a low voice to the man who set up the folding chairs and place cards. He gave her a subtle nod. Your parents gave us the wedding bands before the ceremony. They handed us the rings in a silver clamshell that had been given to your great-grandmother by the man she loved, who had gone to war and never come home. Inside was engraved a proclamation from him to her, "Violet, you will always find me." You had said, what a beautiful name she had. Your mother, cloaked in a fancy pewter-colored shawl, gave us a toast: marriages can float apart. Sometimes we don't notice how far we've gone until all of a sudden, the water meets the horizon and it feels like we'll never make it back. She paused and looked only at me. Listen for each other's heartbeat in the current. You'll always find each other. And then you'll always find the shore. She took your father's hand and you stood to raise your glass. We compliantly made love that night because we were supposed to. We were exhausted. But we felt so real. We had wedding bands and a catering bill and adrenaline headaches. I forever take you, my best friend and my soulmate, to be my partner in life, through everything that's good, and everything that's hard, and the tens of thousands of days that fall somewhere in between. You, Fox Connor, are the person I love. I commit myself to you. Years later, our daughter watched me stuff the dress into the trunk of our car. I was going to take it back to the same place I'd found it. Chapter 4. I remember exactly what life was like in the time that followed. The years before our own Violet came. We ate dinner, late, on the couch, while we watched current affairs shows. We had spicy takeout on a black marble coffee table with vicious corners. We drank glasses of fizzy wine at 2 o'clock on weekend afternoons and then we napped until someone was roused, hours later, by the sound of people walking outside to the bar. Sex happened. Haircuts happened. I read the travel section of the newspaper and felt it was research, realistic research, for the place we'd go next. I browsed expensive stores with a hot, foamy beverage in my hands. I wore Italian leather gloves in the winter. You golfed with friends. I cared about politics. We cuddled on the lounge chair and thought it was nice to be together, touching. Movies were a thing I could watch, something that could take my mind away from the place where I sat today. Life was less visceral. Ideas were brighter. Words came easier. My period was light. You played music throughout the house, new stuff, artists someone had mentioned to you over a beer at an establishment filled with adults. The laundry soap wasn't organic and so our clothes smelled artificially mountain fresh. We went to the mountains. You asked about my writing. I never looked at another man and wondered what he'd be like to fuck instead. You drove a very impractical car every day until the 4th or 5th snowfall of the year. You wanted a dog. We noticed dogs, on the street, we stopped to scratch their necks. The park was not my only reprieve from housework. The books we read had no pictures. We did not think about the impact of television screens on brains. We did not understand that children liked things best if they were manufactured for the purpose of an adult's use. We thought we knew each other. And we thought we knew ourselves. Chapter 5. The summer I was 27. 2 weathered folding chairs on the balcony overlooking the alley between us and the building next door. The string of white paper lanterns I hung had somehow made palpable the creeping smell of hot garbage from below. That was where you said to me over glasses of crisp white wine, "Let's start trying. Tonight." We'd talked about it before, many times. You were practically gleeful when I held other people's babies or got down on my knees to play with them. You're a natural. But I was the one who was imagining motherhood. What it would be like. How it would feel. Looks good on you. I would be different. I would be like other women for whom it all came so easily. I would be everything my own mother was not. She barely entered my mind in those days. I made sure of it. And when she slipped in uninvited, I blew her away. As if she were those ashes falling into my orange juice. By that summer, we'd rented a bigger apartment with a second bedroom in a building with a very slow elevator. The walk-up we lived in before wouldn't work for a stroller. We drew each other's attention to baby things with small nudges, never words. Tiny trendy outfits in store windows. Little siblings dutifully holding hands. There was anticipation. There was hope. Months earlier I had started paying more attention to my period. Tracked my ovulation. I'd made notes to mark the dates in my day planner. One day I found little happy faces drawn next to my O's. Your excitement was endearing. You were going to be a wonderful father. And I would be your child's wonderful mother. I look back and marvel at the confidence I found then. I no longer felt like my mother's daughter. I felt like your wife. I had been pretending I was perfect for you for years. I wanted to keep you happy. I want to be anyone other than the mother I came from. And so I wanted a baby, too. Chapter 6. The Ellingtons. They lived 3 doors down from the house I grew up in, and their lawn was the only one in the neighborhood that stayed green through the dry, relentless summers. Mrs. Ellington knocked on our door exactly 72 hours after Cecilia had left me. My father was still snoring on the sofa where he had slept each night for the past year. I had realized only an hour earlier that my mother wasn't going to come home this time. I'd gone through her dresser and the drawers in the bathroom and the place where she stashed her cartons of cigarettes. Everything that mattered to her was gone. I knew enough by then not to ask my father where she went. "Would you like to come for a nice Sunday roast at our house, Blythe?" Her tight curls were shiny and hard, fresh from the salon, and I couldn't help but reply directly to them with a nod and a thank you. I went straight to the laundry room and put my best outfit, a navy blue jumper and a rainbow-striped turtleneck, in the washing machine. I had thought of asking her if my father could come, too, but Mrs. Ellington was the most socially appropriate woman I knew, and I figured if she didn't include him in her invitation, there was a reason. Thomas Ellington Jr. was the best friend I had. I don't remember when I'd given him that distinction, but by the time I was 10, he was the only person I cared to play with. Other girls my age made me uneasy. My life looked different from theirs: their easy-bake ovens, their homemade hair bows, their proper socks. Their mothers. I learned very early on that being different from them didn't feel good. But the Ellingtons made me feel good. The thing about Mrs. Ellington's invitation was that she must have somehow known my mother had left. Because my mother no longer allowed me to attend dinner at the Ellingtons. At some point she had decided I needed to be home by 4:45 every night. Although there was nothing to come home to, the oven was always cold and the fridge was always empty. By then, most evenings my father and I ate instant oatmeal. He'd bring home small packets of brown sugar for the top, ones he stuffed in his pockets from the cafeteria at the hospital, where he managed the cleaning staff. He made decent enough money then, by local standards at least. We just didn't seem to live that way. I had somehow learned that it was polite to bring a gift when invited to a nice dinner, so I had clipped a fistful of hydrangeas from our front bush, although late September had turned most of the white petals to a crispy dusty pink. I tied the stems with my rubber hair elastic. "You're such a thoughtful young woman," Mrs. Ellington had said. She put them in a blue vase and placed them carefully on the table in the middle of the steaming dishes. Thomas's younger brother, Daniel, adored me. We played trains in the living room after school while Thomas did his homework with his mother. I always saved mine for after 8 o'clock, when Cecilia either went to bed or was gone for the night to the city. She did that often, went to the city and came back the next day. So doing my homework then gave me something to do while I waited for my eyes to get tired. Little Daniel fascinated me. He spoke like an adult and knew how to multiply when he was just 5 years old. I would quiz him on the times tables while we played on the Ellington's scratchy orange rug, amazed at how clever he was. Mrs. Ellington would pop in to listen and always touched each of our heads before she left. "Good job, you two." Thomas was smart, too, but in different ways. He made up the most incredible stories, which we'd write in the tiny spiral notebooks his mother bought us at the corner store. Then we'd draw pictures to go along with every page. Each book would take us weeks. We painstakingly discussed what to draw for each part of the story and then took our time sharpening the whole box of pencils before we began. Once Thomas let me bring one home, a story I loved about a family with a beautiful, kind mother who became very sick with a rare form of deadly chickenpox. They go for their last vacation together as a family to a faraway island, where they find a tiny, magical gnome in the sand named George, who speaks only in rhymes. He grants them the gift of one special superpower in exchange for bringing him home in their suitcase to the other side of the world. They agree, and he gives them what they wish for. Your mom will live forever, until the end of time. Whenever you get sad, just sing this little rhyme. The gnome lives inside the mother's pocket for eternity, happily ever after. I'd drawn the family carefully on the pages of this book. They looked just like the Ellingtons, but with a third child who didn't look anything like them, a daughter with Crayola peach skin like mine. One morning I found my mother sitting on the edge of my bed, flipping through the book, which I'd hidden deep in my drawer. "Where did this come from?" She spoke without looking at me and stopped on the page where I'd drawn myself as part of the Black family. "I made it. With Thomas. At his house." I reached for the book in her hands, my book. The reach was pleading. She yanked her arm away from me, and then tossed the book at my head, as though the spiraled pages and everything about them disgusted her. The corner clipped my chin and the book landed between us on the floor. I stared at it, embarrassed. Of the pictures she didn't like, of the fact that I'd been hiding it from her. My mother stood up, her thin neck erect, her shoulders back. She shut the door quietly behind her. I brought the book back to Thomas's house the next day. "Why don't you want to keep it? You were so proud of what you two made together." Mrs. Ellington took it from my hands and saw that it was bent in a few places. She smoothed the cover softly. "It's okay," she said, shaking her head so that I didn't have to answer. "You can keep it here." She put it on the bookshelf in their living room. When I was leaving that day, I noticed she'd opened the book to the last page and faced it out toward the room. The family of 5, me included, our arms around one another, an explosion of tiny hearts coming from our smiling mother who stood in the middle. At the Sunday dinner on the night my mother left, I offered to clean the kitchen with Mrs. Ellington. She clicked on a cassette tape and sang just a little as she cleared the table and wiped the counters. I watched her bashfully from the corner of my eye while I rinsed the dishes. At one point she stopped and picked up the oven mitt from the counter. She looked at me with a playful smile, slipped it over her hand, and held it up beside her head. "Miss Blythe," she said in a funny high-pitched voice, her hand moving in the puppet. "We ask all of our celebrity guests here on the Ellington After Dinner Talk Show a few questions about themselves. So, tell us, what do you like to do for fun? Ever go to the movies?" I laughed awkwardly, not sure how to play along. Yeah. Sometimes. I hadn't ever been to the movies. I also hadn't ever talked to a puppet. I looked down and shuffled some dishes around in the sink. Thomas came running into the kitchen squealing, "Mommy's doing the talk show again," and Daniel flew in behind him. "Ask me something, ask me." Mrs. Ellington stood with one hand on her hip and the other hand chatting away, her voice squeaking from the corner of her mouth. Mr. Ellington popped his head in to watch. "Now, Daniel, what is your very favorite thing to eat? And you can't say ice cream," said the puppet. He jumped up and down while he thought of his answer and Thomas shouted options. "Pie. I know it's pie." Mrs. Ellington's oven mitt gasped, "Pie. Not rhubarb, though, right?" That gives me the toots, and the boys screamed over each other in laughter. I listened to them carry on. I'd never felt anything like this before. The spontaneity. The silliness. The comfort. Mrs. Ellington saw me watching from the sink and called me over with her finger. She put the oven mitt on my hand and said, "A guest host tonight? What a treat." And then she whispered to me, "Go ahead, ask the boys what they'd rather do. Eat worms or someone else's boogers." I snickered. She rolled her eyes and smiled, as if to say, "Trust me, they'll love it, those silly boys." She walked me home that night, which she had never done before. All the lights in my house were off. She watched as I unlocked the door, to make sure my dad's shoes were in the hallway. And then from her pocket she pulled the book about the magical gnome and gave it to me. "Thought you might want this back now." I did. I flipped the pages with my thumb and thought, for the first time that night, about my mother. I thanked her again for dinner. She turned around at the end of my driveway and called, "Same time next week. If I don't see you before then." I suspect she knew she would. Chapter 7. I knew as soon as you came inside of me. Your warmth filled me and I knew. I couldn't blame you for thinking I was crazy. We'd been trying for months, but nearly 3 weeks later we laughed together lying on our bathroom floor like drunken fools. Everything had changed. You skipped work for the day, remember? We watched movies in bed and ordered takeout for each meal. We just wanted to be together. You and me. And her. I knew she was a girl. I couldn't write anymore. My head flew away every time I tried. To what she would look like and who she would be. I began doing prenatal exercise classes. We started each class in a stretching circle where we introduced ourselves and said how many months along we were. I was fascinated to see what was coming, looking at the other women's bellies in the mirror as we followed an aerobic routine that barely seemed worth doing. My own body was still unchanged and I couldn't wait to see her make room for herself. In me. In the world. Walking through the city to go about my day had changed. I had a secret. I half expected people to look at me differently. I wanted to touch my still flat belly and say, "I'm going to be a mother. This is who I am now." I was consumed. There was a day at the library when I flipped through books for hours in the pregnancy and childbirth section. I had just started to show. A woman walked by me, searching the spines for a particular book. The one she slid out from the shelf was a well-used guide to sleep. "How far along?" 6 months. She scanned the table of contents with her finger and then looked at my middle before my face. "You?" 21 weeks. We nodded to each other. She looked like she used to make homemade kombucha and go to 6 a.m. spin classes, but now settled for leftover puree and a walk to the store for diapers. I haven't even thought about sleep yet. "You're first." I nodded and smiled. "This is my second." The woman lifted the book. "Honestly, just figure out the sleep and you'll be fine. Nothing else matters." I really fucked that up the first time. I laughed, sort of, and thanked her for the tip. A child's well broke from across the library and she sighed. "That's mine." She gestured up and over her shoulder, and then pulled out a second copy of the same book she was there for. She held it out to me and I noticed she had pink marker on her hands. "Good luck." She looked tall and feminine from behind as she walked away, her wide hips, her shoulder-length hair creased from what sleep she had found. She felt, to me, so obviously a mother. Was it the way she looked, or moved? Was it the way she seemed to have more to care about than I did? When would this happen to me, this crossover? How was I about to change? Chapter 8. "Fox, come see." It was the third huge box your mother had sent since we told them about the baby. She was relentless in her excitement and called every week to see how I was feeling. I pulled out fancy swaddle blankets and knitted newborn hats and teeny-tiny white sleepers. At the bottom there was a separate package on which she'd written Fox's baby things. In it was a worn teddy bear with buttons for eyes, and a threadbare flannel blanket with silk trim that once had been ivory white. A small porcelain figurine of a baby boy sitting on a moon with your name in delicate gold script. I lifted the teddy to my nose and then to yours. You reminisced. I half listened, but my mind was elsewhere, searching my past for the same kind of familiar tokens, blankets and stuffies and favorite books, but I couldn't find any. Do you think we can do this? I asked you over dinner that night, pushing my food around the plate. I could barely stomach meat since I'd become pregnant. Do what? Be parents. Raise a child. You reached over and smiled as you stabbed my beef with your fork. You're going to be a good mother, Blythe. You traced a heart on the top of my hand. You know, my own mother, she left. She wasn't anything like yours. I know. You were quiet. You could have asked me to say more. You could have held my hand and looked me in the eye and asked me to keep talking. You took my plate to the sink. You're different, you said eventually, and hugged me from behind. And then, with an indignation in your voice that I didn't expect, you aren't anything like her. I believed you. Life was easier when I believed you. Afterward we lay together on the couch and you held my belly like the world was in your hands. We loved waiting for her to move, staring at my stretched skin, the blue-green hue of the veins underneath like the colors of the earth. Some fathers talk to their wife's belly, they say the baby can hear. But as we watched for her to show us she was in there, you were quiet and awestruck, like she was a dream you couldn't believe was real. Chapter 9. Today could be the day. The baby felt heavy and low in the morning and I dreamed all night of my amniotic fluid soaking our bed. The panic came quickly and pulled me to a place I'd consciously avoided for the entire 40 weeks of my pregnancy. I whispered to myself as I boiled the water for tea. It's okay if she comes. It's okay if this is it. It's okay to have this baby. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote these mantras on a piece of paper over and over until you walked into the room. The car seat's in. I'll keep my phone in my hand all day. I slid the piece of paper under the placemat. You kissed me and left for work. I knew. By 7:30 that night we were on the bedroom floor together, my knees splintered from the grooves in the old parquet flooring. You pressed on my hips while I tried to breathe deeply, evenly. We'd practiced this. We'd done the class. But I couldn't find that sense of calm I'd been promised, the intuition that was supposed to kick in. You were keeping track of things with chicken scratch, minutes and contractions. I ripped the scorecard from your hand and threw it back at you. We're going now. I couldn't be in our apartment anymore. She was volcanic and I was fighting to keep her in. None of what I'd prepared for felt possible. I wasn't open, I wasn't ready. I couldn't visualize her dropping into my open pelvis, I couldn't coax myself to expand like the mouth of a river. I was clenched and scared. I didn't know what to do. What they say about the pain is true. I can no longer remember what it felt like. I remember the diarrhea. I remember how cold the room was. I remember seeing the forceps on a cart in the hallway decorated with Christmas tinsel garland as we walked between contractions. The nurse had hands like a lumberjack. When she shoved them in me to check my dilation, I would whimper and she would look away. I don't want this to happen, I whispered to nobody. I was exhausted. You were standing 2 feet away, drinking the water the nurse had brought for me. I couldn't keep it down. You don't want what to happen? The baby. You mean the birth? No, I mean the baby. Do you want the epidural now? I think you need it. You craned your neck to look for a nurse and put a cold cloth on the back of my neck. I remember you holding my hair like a horse's mane. I didn't want the drugs. I wanted to feel how bad it could get. Punish me, I said to her. Rip me apart. You kissed my head and I smacked you away. I hated you. For everything you wanted of me. I begged for them to let me push on the toilet. I was most comfortable there and I was delirious by that point. I couldn't follow a thing anyone said to me. You coaxed me back to the bed and they ordered me into the stirrups. Nothing about it felt right. The burning. I reached down to feel the flames I was sure were there, but someone pushed away my hand. Fuck you. Come on now, the doctor said. You can do this. I can't. I won't, I spat back. You have to push, you said calmly. I closed my eyes and I willed something horrible to go wrong. Death. I wanted a death. Mine or the baby's. I didn't think, even then, that we would survive each other. When she came out, the doctor held her over my face, but I could barely see her in the assault of bright light. I shook vigorously from the pain and said that I might be sick. You appeared at my hip, next to the doctor, and he turned toward you instead, saying the baby was a girl. You put your hand under her slippery head and brought her carefully to your face. You said something to her. I don't know what you had, your own secret language from her first minute in this world. The doctor then cupped her belly, like she was a wet kitten, and handed her over to the nurse. He went back to work. My afterbirth splashed onto the floor. He tugged at my opening with suture thread while I stared at the light in awe of what I'd just done. I was one of them now, the mothers. I had never felt so alive, so electric. My teeth chattered so hard that I thought they might chip. And then I heard her. The howl. She sounded so familiar. Are you ready, Mom? Someone said. They placed her on my bare chest. She felt like a warm, screaming loaf of bread. She had been cleaned of my blood and bundled in the hospital's flannel blanket. Her nose was speckled with yellow. Her eyes looked slimy and dark and they stared right into mine. I'm your mother. The first night in the hospital I didn't sleep. I stared at her quietly behind the perforated curtain that surrounded the bed. Her toes were a row of tiny snow peas. I would open her blanket and trace my finger along her skin and watch her twitch. She was alive. She came from me. She smelled like me. She didn't latch for my colostrum, not even when they squished my breast like a hamburger and pried at her chin. They said to give it time. The nurse offered to take her while I slept, but I needed to stare at her. I didn't notice my tears until they dropped onto her face. I wiped each one from her skin with my pinky and then tasted it. I wanted to taste her. Her fingers. The tops of her ears. I wanted to feel them in my mouth. I was physically numb from the painkillers, but inside I felt lit on fire by oxytocin. Some mothers might have called it love, but it felt more to me like astonishment. Like wonder. I didn't think about what to do next, about what we would do when we got home. I didn't think about raising her and caring for her and who she would become. I wanted to be alone with her. In that surreal space of time, I wanted to feel every pulse. A part of me knew we would never exist like that again. 1962. Etta turned on the bath faucet to wash Cecilia's long, tangled hair. She was 5 years old and it wasn't often anyone made her brush it. Her elbows dug into the avocado green ceramic. Lean back, Etta said and tugged her hard. She pulled her head a few inches farther until Cecilia was square under the thunder of cold water. She gasped and choked and wrestled, until she pulled free of Etta's fingers clutched in her skin. When she caught her breath, she looked up to see Etta staring right at her. Etta didn't flinch. Cecilia knew she wasn't done. Etta grabbed her ears and forced her back under again. Her nostrils stung as they filled with water. Her head started to feel like it was floating away. And then Etta let go. She pulled out the moldy plug from the drain and left the bathroom. Cecilia didn't move. She had shit herself during the fight and lay there, shaking and foul and cold, until she fell asleep. When she woke up, Etta was in bed and Henry was home from work, sitting in the living room watching television, eating a plate of reheated roast beef, the tinfoil carefully folded on the table to be reused the next day. Cecilia walked into the room with a towel draped over her shoulders and startled him. He asked through a mouthful of food why on earth she wasn't asleep at nearly midnight. Cecilia told him she'd wet the bed. His face fell. He folded her up in his long arms and carried her to her mother's bed. She still stank like shit, but Henry didn't say a thing about it. He shook Etta awake. "Dear, can you fix Cecilia's sheets? She's wet herself." Cecilia held her breath. Etta opened her eyes and took Cecilia's hand in the same grip that had nearly killed her 5 hours ago. She walked her to her room and put a nightgown over her head and sat her firmly on the bed. Cecilia's heart pounded as they both listened to Henry's footsteps go back down the stairs. Cecilia was always listening for Henry's footsteps. He would change Etta's mood like the flip of a light switch. Etta didn't say a word and she didn't touch her. She just left the room. Cecilia understood that her instinct to lie was the right one. What had happened between her and her mother was to stay a secret. Other times over the next few years when Etta's problems with nerves were obvious to Cecilia. Some days she would lock her out of the house after school. The front door was bolted shut, the back door locked, the drapes all closed. But Cecilia could hear the radio playing or the kitchen tap running. She'd go to Main Street to kill time by wandering the aisles of stores, looking at things her mother never seemed interested in buying anymore, like fruit-scented soaps, or the mint chocolates she had once enjoyed. After it had been dark for 1 hour, Cecilia would head home again. Henry would be there and dinner would be on the table. She would tell Henry she'd been at the library and he'd pat her on the head and say she'd become the smartest student in the class if she kept studying so hard. Etta would ignore her completely, as though she hadn't spoken at all. Other days, Cecilia would come down for breakfast in the morning and Etta would be sitting at the table, looking down at her lap, her full cheeks white. Like she hadn't slept a wink. Cecilia didn't know what she did during those nights, but on those mornings, Etta seemed especially distant. Especially sad. She wouldn't look up until she heard Henry's feet hit the stairs. Chapter 10. "You're anxious. She can sense it," you said. She'd cried for 5.5 hours. I cried for 4 of those. I made you look up the definition of colic in one of the baby books. More than 3 hours, for 3 days a week, for 3 weeks straight. She's been crying longer than that. She's only been here for 5 days, Blythe. I mean hours. Longer than 3 hours. She's just gassy, I think. I need you to cancel your parents' trip here. I couldn't deal with your perfect mother being there for Christmas in a couple of weeks. She called constantly, and every conversation started with "I know things are different these days, but trust me." Gripe water. Tighter swaddles. Rice cereal in the bottle. They'll be a big help for you, honey. For all of us. You wanted your perfect mother there. I'm still bleeding through my pad. I smell like rotting flesh. I can't put my shirt on, my boobs are too sore. Look at me, Fox. I'll call them tonight. Can you take her? Give her here. Go get some sleep. I think the baby hates me. Shush. I'd been warned about those hard, early days. I'd been warned about breasts like cement boulders. Cluster feeds. The squirt bottle. I'd read all the books. I'd done the research. Nobody talked about the feeling of being woken up after 40 minutes of sleep, on blood-stained sheets, with the dread of knowing what had to happen next. I felt like the only mother in the world who wouldn't survive it. The only mother who couldn't recover from having her perineum stitched from her anus to her vagina. The only mother who couldn't fight through the pain of newborn gums cutting like razor blades on her nipples. The only mother who couldn't pretend to function with her brain in the vice of sleeplessness. The only mother who looked down at her daughter and thought, please, go away. Violet cried only when she was with me. It felt like a betrayal. We were supposed to want each other. Chapter 11. The night nurse had the softest hands I had ever felt. She barely fit in the nursery chair. She smelled like citrus fruit and hairspray, and she was unflappable. I was tired. Every new mom goes through this, Blythe. I know it's hard. I remember. But your mother must have been worried because she hired the woman without asking us and paid her fee. We were 3 weeks in and the baby wouldn't sleep longer than an hour and a half at a time. All she wanted to do was feed and cry. My nipples looked like raw ground beef. You barely saw the night nurse. You were asleep most nights before she came. She brought me the baby every 3 hours, not a minute sooner or later. I would hear her heavy feet coming toward the door and startle from the glorious depths of sleep and fish my breast out of my nightshirt with my eyes barely open. I would hand her back when we were done. She would take her to the nursery and burp her, change her, rock her, and put her to sleep in the bassinet. We rarely exchanged a word, but I loved her. I needed her. She came for 4 weeks until your mother said to me on the phone in her firm but delicate voice, "Honey, it's been a month. You need to do it on your own now." On the last shift she was with us, the night nurse brought the baby into our room for the early morning feed before she went home. But she didn't step out of the room like she normally did. You were snoring beside me. "She's a sweet baby, isn't she?" I had whispered to the woman. I shifted to relieve my stubborn hemorrhoids and then fiddled with my nipple in her mouth. I really didn't know if she was, but it felt like something a new mother would say of the warm, pink flesh she'd pushed into the world. She stood over us and looked down at Violet and my huge brown nipple as she tried to latch again. We still hadn't got the hang of it yet and milk sprayed the baby's face. She didn't answer me. "Do you think she's a good baby?" Maybe she hadn't heard me. I winced. The baby was on. The nurse stepped back and watched us as though she were trying to figure something out. Sometimes she opens her eyes so wide and looks right at me, like she let her words trail off, and then she shook her head and sucked through her teeth. "She's curious. She's alert," I clarified with words I'd heard other mothers use. I wasn't sure what she was implying. She stood still and silent while I fed. She nodded some time later. Too much time later. I wondered if there was something else she wanted to say. When the baby was done, she lifted Violet quietly and patted me on the shoulder. She left to put her down and I never saw her again. You were irritated when it took weeks for the smell of the woman's hairspray to leave the nursery, but sometimes I went in there just for the scent of her. Chapter 12. The month with the night nurse helped. Violet and I emerged from the fog and found ourselves a routine. I focused a lot on that routine. Our day was bookended by you leaving for work and you arriving home again. All I had to do was keep her alive in between. One thing a day, that was always my goal. A few groceries. Her doctor's appointment. Exchanging a Odyssey I'd bought that she never wore and had already grown out of. Coffee and a muffin. I'd sit on the park bench in the cold and pick away at the dry bits of bran while I stared at her stuffed in a down-filled snowsuit, and waited for the next nap time. I'd met a small group of women in the prenatal exercise class who had all been due around the same time as me. I didn't know them well, but was added to their email chain at some point. They often invited me to meet for a walk, or lunch somewhere that would accommodate our brigade of strollers. You loved when I had plans with them. You were excited for me to be like other moms. I mostly went for you. To show you I was normal. Like all of days, the conversations had a mundane routine. How the babies slept and where, when they ate and how much, the plan for solid foods, daycare or nanny, what contraptions they'd bought that they couldn't live without that the rest of us needed to buy, too. Eventually it would be nap time for one of the babies, which was allowed only at home in the crib so as not to disturb the hard-earned schedule. And so we'd pack it up and go. Sometimes, as we paid the bill, I'd find the courage to say what really was on my mind. I threw it out like bait. This is pretty hard some days, isn't it? This whole motherhood thing. Sometimes. Yeah. But it's the most rewarding thing we'll ever do, you know. It's all so worth it when you see their little faces in the morning. I studied these women closely, trying to find their lies. They never cracked. They never slipped. Totally. I always gave some indication of agreement. But then I would stare at Violet's face in the stroller all the way home, wondering why she didn't feel like the best thing that had ever happened to me. Once, week after I'd stopped joining those girls, I passed the window of a coffee shop where at the counter inside, overlooking the street, a mother sat staring at her baby. Maybe 3 or 4 months old, just a bit younger than Violet. The baby was slumped in the grasp of its mother's fingers, staring straight back at her. The woman's mouth did not move. There was no assurance from between her lips. "You're Mama's baby, you're my sweet baby. You're such a good baby, aren't you?" Instead, she turned the baby ever so slightly to one side, and then to the other, as though she were examining a clay artifact for marks of imperfection. I lingered outside the window and I watched them, looking for love, looking for regret. I pictured the life she might have had before the baby had confined her to choose between the option of a stuffy, messy apartment that smelled like her own soured milk or the lonely window of a coffee shop. I went inside and ordered a latte that I didn't want and sat on the stool next to her. Violet was asleep in the stroller and I pushed it back and forth gently so she wouldn't wake up. The diaper bag slipped from the handle and her bottle fell out and rolled across the floor. I collected it and decided I would not wipe off the nipple. I felt a rush of power when I made clandestine decisions like this, decisions other mothers would not make because they weren't supposed to, like leaving a wet diaper on too long or skipping her overdue bath again because I couldn't be bothered. The woman turned to me and we shared a look. Not a smile, but an acknowledgement that we had both morphed into a version of ourselves that didn't feel as good as had been advertised. Curds of milk came out of her baby's mouth and she wiped it with a rough paper napkin. Tough days, aren't they? I had said, lifting my chin toward her baby who was still and expressionless, staring at her. There's that saying, the days are long but the years go fast. I nodded and looked at my own baby, who was starting to stir, her chin crinkling. But I guess we'll see, she said flatly, like she, too, did not believe her experience of time would ever change again. Some women say being a mom is their greatest accomplishment. But I dunno, I don't feel like I've accomplished much yet. I laughed a little bit, because it was feeling too personal all of a sudden. But I needed this woman. She was everything the lunchtime friends were not. A girl. I told her the baby's name. Harry, she said of hers. He's been here 15 weeks. We sat in silence for a few more minutes. And then she said, it's like he just happened to me, all of a sudden. Slammed into my world and knocked over the furniture. Yeah, I said slowly, looking at her baby as though he were a weapon. You want them and grow them and push them out, but they happen to you. She took Harry off the counter and put him in the stroller. She tucked the blanket under him sloppily, like a poorly made bed. She still hadn't spoken to her son in a sing-song voice, like all of those other mothers, and I wondered if she ever did. See you around, she said, and my heart sank. I was worried we'd never find each other again. I stammered, trying to find something else to say to keep her there. Do you live around here? No, I don't actually. We live a bit north of the city. I'm just down here for an appointment. I'll give you my number, I said, my face flushed. I had never been comfortable making friends. But I suddenly flashed forward to late-night texting, when we would exchange brutally honest grievances and lament our existence. Oh. Sure. Here, I'll put it in my phone. She looked uncomfortable, and I wish I hadn't offered as I told her my cell number. She was never in touch and I never ran into her again. I still think of that woman sometimes. I wonder if she eventually felt she'd achieved something, if she looks at Harry today and knows she did well as a mother, that she raised a good person. I wonder how that feels. Chapter 13. She smiled at you first. After bath time. You were wearing your reading glasses and said she must have seen her own reflection in the lens. But we both knew she wanted you the most from the beginning. I could never comfort her when she cried like you could. She melted into your skin and seemed to want to stay there, a part of you. My warmth and my smell seemed to mean nothing to her. They talk about the mother's heartbeat and the familiar sound of her womb, but it's as though I were a foreign country. I listened to you placate her with soft whispers that soothed her to sleep. I studied you. I imitated you. You told me it was all in my head, that I was making a big deal out of nothing. That she was just a baby and babies didn't know how not to like a person. But it felt like 2 against 1. We were together around the clock, and so yes, there were inevitably times she gave in, falling asleep on my chest or at my breast. You'd point this out like it was proof I was wrong. See, honey. Just relax more around her and she'll be fine. I believed you. I had to. I would run my nose over the fine hair on her head and breathe her in. Her smell was good for me. Her smell was a reminder that she had come from within me. That we were once attached by a living, throbbing cord of blood. I would close my eyes and replay the night she came out. Looking, feeling, for our connection. Those first hours. I knew it had been there. Before the chapped, bleeding nipples and the utter exhaustion and the crippling doubt and the unspeakable numbness. You're doing great. I'm proud of you. You would sometimes whisper this to me in the dark while I fed her. You would touch both of our heads. Your girls. Your world. I would cry when you left the room. I didn't want to be the axis around which you both spun. I had nothing left to give either of you, but our lives had just begun together. What had I done? Why had I wanted her? Why did I think I would be any different than the mother I came from? I thought about ways to get out. There, in the dark, my milk flowing, the chair rocking. I thought about putting her down in the crib and leaving in the middle of the night. I thought about where my passport was. About the hundreds of flights listed on the departures board at the airport. About how much cash I could take out from the ATM at once. About leaving my phone there on the bedside table. How long my milk would take to go dry, for my breasts to give up the proof she had been born. My arms shook with the possibility. These are thoughts I never let leave my lips. These are thoughts most mothers don't have. Chapter 14. I was 8 years old and it was far past my bedtime. I'd been standing in the hallway in my nightgown listening to my mother and father fight in the living room. There'd been the sound of breaking glass. I knew it was the figurine of the woman in the full southern dress holding the sun umbrella. I'm not sure where it had come from, a wedding gift perhaps. They'd been arguing about something he found in her coat pocket, and then my mother's trips to the city, and then someone named Lenny, and then me. My father felt I was becoming too quiet, too withdrawn. That I could benefit from some more attention from her once in a while. She doesn't need me, Seb. You're her mother, Cecilia. She'd be better off if I wasn't. When my mother started sobbing, really crying, something I hadn't heard from her before despite the vitriol they flung at each other on a near nightly basis, I turned to go back to my room. My face was hot and the strange shrill of her voice made my stomach clench. But then I'd heard my father say my grandmother's name. He said, "You'll end up just like Etta." My father's footsteps headed for the kitchen. I heard the heavy bottom of 2 glass tumblers hit the counter and then the splash of whiskey. The drink calmed her down. They were done. I knew this part of the routine, the point where she tired herself out and my father drank himself to sleep. But that night she wanted to talk. I slid my back down the wall and crouched on the floor. I sat there for the next hour and listened to her speak to him, those fragments of her past burning my mind for the first time. That night, my father sat in the bedroom with her, which he rarely did. When I woke up in the morning, their door was closed. I made myself breakfast and went to school, and that night they didn't fight. They were calm, civil. I did my homework. I saw my mother touch his back as she put the plate of overcooked chicken in front of him. He thanked her and called her dear. She was trying. He was forgiving. This would become something I did often over the next few years after that night. In my bed upstairs, when I heard Etta's name and I knew something had set my mother off again, my heart would race. I barely breathed as she spoke so that I could hear every word she told my father. Those rare nights were like gifts to me, although she would never know it. I was desperate to know who she was before she became my mother. I started to understand, during those sleepless nights replaying the things I'd overheard, that we are all grown from something. That we carry on the seed, and I was a part of her garden. 1964. Cecilia couldn't sleep without her doll, Bethan, even at the age of 7. She loved the doll more than anything, the smell, the feeling of the silk hair between her fingers as she fell asleep. She searched for it frantically one night, trying to remember where she'd seen it. Etta shouted angrily from the bottom of the basement stairs and Cecilia knew she was irritated by her stomping all over the house when she should have been in bed. "She's down here, Cecilia." There was a small pickle cellar in the basement, about the size of a dog kennel. Etta had stopped canning pickles years before, and they'd almost eaten what was left. She crouched at the cellar door, her bum sticking out toward her daughter. "Way at the back. You must have put it in there." "I did not. I hate that cellar." "Well, I can't fit in. Go in and get her." Cecilia whined that her nightshirt would get dirty. That she didn't like it in there. But she could see Bethan lying in the corner. "Don't be such a scaredy cat, Cecilia. If you want her, go get her." Cecilia got down on all fours and Etta pushed her forward. She fell onto her forearms and started to whimper, but she wanted Bethan badly, so she slowly inched toward the back of the small, dark cave. The pickle jars that lined the walls looked like swamp water and she started having trouble breathing. Something creaked behind her, but the walls of the cellar were too narrow for her to turn around. She realized then that the last sliver of light she'd seen on the glass jars around her was gone. She couldn't get enough air and called louder for Etta. The rubble under her knees dug into her skin every time she twitched. She inched back and tried kicking open the door with her heel, but it was jammed. She heard the phone ring from the living room. Etta's heavy footsteps pounded the stairs. "Hello," she heard her say, and then it was quiet for a moment, until the television set came on, and then the familiar voice of the evening news. Cecilia heard Etta's muffled voice again speaking into the phone. It was September 1964 and the findings of the Warren Commission were being released. Etta, like everyone else, was obsessed with JFK's assassination. Etta never came back. Henry levered the door open when he got home from his night shift. He hauled Cecilia out by the ankles. Her fists were scraped. There was an argument about taking her to the hospital to be checked out. He thought her breathing was shallow and her eyes didn't look right. But Etta won. They stayed home. Henry sat near Cecilia's bed while she slept. He put cold cloths on her head and didn't go to work in the morning. None of them spoke to one another for days. Henry took the door off the cellar and moved the few remaining pickle jars to the pantry in the kitchen. That door never worked properly, he said and shook his head. A week later Etta whispered something to Cecilia when she cleared her dinner plate. Henry was at work. They were listening to the news on the kitchen radio. Cecilia couldn't quite hear her, but what she thought Etta said was, "I meant to go back for you, Cecilia." She put her lips on Cecilia's cheek and lingered there for a moment. Cecilia didn't ask Etta to repeat herself. Chapter 15. Time goes by so quickly. Enjoy every moment. Mothers speak of time like it's the only currency we know. Can you believe it? Can you believe she's already 6 months old? Other women would say this to me, nearly chipper, idling their strollers back and forth on the sidewalk as their babies slept under expensive, gauzy white blankets, their pacifiers bobbing. I would look down at Violet, staring up at me from where she lay, her fists waving, her legs stiff, wanting. And I would wonder how we'd made it so far. 6 whole months. It felt like 6 years. It's the best job in the world, isn't it? Motherhood? This was what the doctor said at one of Violet's appointments for her shots. She was a mother of 3. I told her about my recurring hemorrhoids the size of grapes, about how long it had been since we'd had sex, since I'd even thought of your penis in passing. Her eyebrows lifted with her smile. Yep. I get it. I really do. As though I were a part of the club now, privy to its unspoken truths. What I couldn't tell her was that I felt I'd aged a century since I'd given birth to Violet. That she seemed to stretch every hour we spent together. That the months had crawled by so slowly I'd often splash cold water on my face during the day to see if I was just dreaming, if that's why time never made any sense to me. It's like you blink, and they're suddenly such big girls. They become these sweet little people right before your eyes. Violet seemed to grow so slowly. I never noticed a change in her until you shook it in front of my face. You would tell me her clothes were too small, that her belly was hanging below her shirts, that her leggings came up almost to her knees. You would pack away her baby toys and buy her things on your way home from work that blinked and beeped, things for tiny humans who are developing, learning, thinking. I was just trying to keep her alive. I was focused on her eating and her sleeping and the probiotic drops that I could never seem to remember. I was focused on getting through the days as they rolled like boulders into one another. Chapter 16. Us. No couple can imagine what their relationship will be like after having children. But there's an expectation that you'll be in it together. That you'll be a team where the teamwork is possible. Our operation functioned. Our child was fed and bathed and walked and rocked and clothed and changed, and you did everything you could. I had her all day, but when you came through the door, she was yours. Patience. Love. Affection. I was grateful for everything you gave her that she didn't want from me. I watched you too and I was envious. I wanted what you had. But this imbalance came at a cost. We had shifted away from our easy, treasured decade of comfort. Instead, my presence made you withdraw. Your judgment made me anxious. The more Violet got from you, the less you gave to me. We still kissed hello and conversed over dinners at restaurants on the odd night we got out together. You always put your hand on the small of my back as we walked closer to our apartment, closer to the nest we'd built together. We had established certain motions and we still went through them. But there were subtle absences. We stopped doing crosswords together. You didn't leave the bathroom door open when you showered. There was space where there hadn't been before, and in that space was resentment. I tried to do better. Becoming a father had made you so beautiful. Your face had changed. Warm. Soft. Your brows lifted more and your mouth was always agape when she was near you. Goofy. You had become a brighter version of the man I knew. I yearned for those things to happen to me, too. But I had become hardened. My face looked angry and tired where life had once lifted my cheekbones and glowed through my blue eyes. I looked like my mother had, right before she left me. Chapter 17. Somewhere in our 7th month together, Violet finally started napping for more than 20 minutes at a time. I went back to my writing. I didn't mention it to you. You always insisted that I sleep while she napped during the day, and asked me when you got home if I had. That was the only thing you cared about. You wanted me alert and patient. You wanted me rested so I could perform my duties. You used to care about me as a person, my happiness, the things that made me thrive. Now I was a service provider. You didn't see me as a woman. I was just the mother of your child. And so I lied to you most days because it was easier that way. Yes, I napped. Yes, I got some rest. But actually, I had been working on a short story. The sentences poured from me. I couldn't remember words flowing this easily before. I'd been prepared for the opposite to happen. Other women writers with babies warned of drained energy and brains that couldn't function on the page like they used to, at least for the first year. But I seemed to come alive when my screen went on. Violet would wake like clockwork after 2 hours, and I was deep in the zone every time I felt physically and emotionally elsewhere. I got into the habit of letting her cry, promising myself just one more page. Sometimes I slipped on my headphones. Sometimes one page turned into 2. Or more. Sometimes I wrote for another hour. When her pitch became frantic enough, I'd flip down my laptop screen and rush to her as though I'd just heard her for the first time. "Oh, hello there. You're awake now. Come see Mommy." I don't know who I was doing this performance for. I felt deeply embarrassed as she pushed me away when I tried to soothe her. How could I have blamed her for rejecting me? The day you came home early. I didn't hear you walk in over her screams and the music in my ears. My heart stopped when you whipped my chair around. You nearly tipped me over. You ran to the bedroom as though the baby was on fire. I held my breath as I listened to you calm her down. She was hysterical. I'm so sorry, you told her. You were so sorry I was her mother. That's what you had meant. You didn't bring her out of the nursery. I sat on the floor in the hallway knowing nothing would be the same between us again. I had broken your trust. I had confirmed every doubt you quietly held about me. When I finally went in, you were rocking her in the chair and your eyes were closed and your head was back. She hiccuped on the pacifier. I walked toward the chair to take her from you, but your arm lifted to hold me back. What the fuck were you doing? I knew better than to make excuses for myself. I had never seen your hands shake with anger before. I went into the shower and I cried until the water was cold. When I came out, you were scrambling eggs while she sat on your hip. She wakes up from her nap every day at 3. It was 4:45 when I walked in. I watched the spatula scrape the frying pan. You let her scream for over an hour and a half. I couldn't look at either of you. Does this happen every day? No, I said firmly. As though that would save my dignity. We still hadn't looked each other in the eye. Violet began fussing. She's hungry. Feed her. You passed her to me and I did. In bed that night you rolled away from me and spoke toward the open window. What's wrong with you? I don't know, I answered. I'm sorry. You need to talk to someone. A doctor. I will. I'm worried for her. Fox. Please. Don't be. I would never have hurt her. I would never have put her in danger. For years afterward, long after she began sleeping through the night, I would wake to the sound of her crying. I would clutch my chest and remember what I'd done. I would remember the cramp of guilt and the overruling satisfaction of ignoring her. I remembered the thrill of writing over the fusion of music and tears. How quickly the page filled. How fast my heart raced. How shameful it felt to be exposed. Chapter 18. My mother couldn't in small spaces. The pantry closet in my childhood home was unused, the shelves dusty and scattered with turds from mice that had come for the stale peanuts and an old, open bag of sugar. The backyard shed was locked. The basement, with its low ceiling, was boarded up with 3 2x4s and rusty nails from the garage that Cecilia had hammered in herself. When I was 8, on a deathly hot day in August, I sat outside our stifling home and watched my mother smoke at the plastic table on the rough, yellow grass that covered our yard from one rotting chain-link fence to the other. There was silence in the air, as though even the sounds from the neighborhood couldn't travel through the thickness I could barely force into my lungs. Earlier that day I'd been at the Ellingtons' house and Mrs. Ellington had sent us into the cold, dank basement for a reprieve. We'd pretended we were having a picnic down there. She brought us a blanket and boiled eggs and apple juice in paper cups with balloons on them, left over from Daniel's birthday party. I asked my mother if we could go down to our basement, too. Couldn't we take the boards off? Couldn't we use the back side of the hammer to pull the nails out, like Dad did to fix the front porch last weekend? No, she snapped. Stop asking. But, Mom, please, I feel sick. It's too hot everywhere else but the basement. Stop asking, Blythe. I'm warning you. I'll die out here thanks to you. She slapped me across the face, but her hand slipped on the sweat of my cheek, so she wound up and hit me again. Only this time it was with a closed fist and right on the mouth. Square and firm. My tooth hit the back of my throat and I coughed speckles of blood on my t-shirt. It's a baby tooth, she said as I stared at it in my palm. They all come out eventually anyway. She put her cigarette out on a patch of dirt in the brittle grass. But I could see her disgust with herself in her twisted tangerine lips. She had never hit me before. And so I had never felt that particular collision of shame and self-pity and heartache. I went to my room and made an accordion fan with a grocery flyer from the mail and lay on the floor in my shirt and underwear. When she came in an hour later, she took the fan from my hand and smoothed the creases and said she needed the coupon to buy chicken thighs. She sat on my bed, something she rarely did. She couldn't stand to be in my room for long. Her husky throat cleared. When I was your age, my mother did something very cruel to me. In the basement. So I can't go down there. I didn't move from the floor. I thought of the things I'd overheard late at night as she cried to my father. My face flushed with her secrets. I watched her bare feet rub against each other, her toes freshly polished in bright, cherry red. Why was she so cruel to you? She could have seen my heart jumping under the bloodstains on my shirt. Something wasn't right with her. Her tone suggested the answer should have been obvious to me even then. She tore the chicken thigh coupon off the bottom of the flyer and folded the rest back into an accordion. I reached out to touch her toe, to feel the smooth polish, to feel her. I never touched her. She flinched, but she didn't pull her foot away. We both stared at my finger on her nail. I'm sorry about your tooth, she said and then stood up. I slowly took my hand away. It was starting to get loose anyway. It was the first time she told me herself about Atta. I think she might have regretted it afterward, because she was especially cold in the weeks that followed. But I remember wanting to touch her more, wanting to be near her. I remember standing at the side of her bed in the mornings to run my finger softly along her cheekbone, and then tiptoeing out when she started to stir. Chapter 19. For the next few months I decided not to write. I decided to focus on Violet. My doctor didn't think I was suffering from postpartum depression, and so neither did I. I'd done a quiz on the clipboard in her waiting room. Have you been stressed or worried for no good reason? No. Have you been dreading things you used to look forward to? No. Have you been so unhappy that you can't sleep? No. Do you have thoughts of harming yourself? No. Do you have thoughts of harming your baby? No. She recommended I make more time for myself and get back to the things I used to enjoy before I had the baby. Like writing. This, I knew, wouldn't go over well with you. Instead, I told you she suggested some exercise and more time outside and a follow-up in 6 weeks. I began walking with Violet in the morning as soon as you left the house. We'd go for hours. I'd take her all the way downtown to your office, and you'd meet us for coffee. You loved the way Violet squealed when she saw you step off the elevator, and you loved to see me with a rosy-fresh face, looking like I was enjoying myself. She was almost a year by then and seemed lit up by the world around her, and so I signed us up for Mommy and Me music classes and a swim program. You warmed to me again. You liked this version of me and it felt good. And by then I had a lot to prove. We kept busy and I kept quiet. Were there good moments? Of course there were. One night I put music on while I cleaned the kitchen. Food was everywhere, all over my clothes and her face and the floor. She laughed in her chair as I danced with the whisk in my hand. Her arms reached out for me. I swooped her up and twirled across the kitchen and she threw her head back and squealed. I realized we had never had these experiences together. We had never found the comfort, the silly, the fun. Mrs. Ellington and her puppet. Maybe we could have that, too. Instead, I was always looking for what was wrong with us. I smothered her in kisses and she pulled away to stare at me. She was used to this kind of affection only from you. She leaned into my face with her wet open lips and made a sound. Yeah. We're trying, aren't we? I whispered. You cleared your throat. You had been watching us there in the doorway. You smiled. I could see the relief as your shoulders relaxed. We were picture perfect in that kitchen. When you came back from changing, you poured 2 glasses of wine and kissed me on the head, and then you said, I was thinking. You should get back to writing again. I'd passed whatever test you were putting me through. We desperately wanted life to feel good. We both had hoped that it could. I put my nose in Violet's sticky neck and took the glass of wine from you. Chapter 20. She said it. I swear to God. Say it again. You crouched down and jiggled her hips. Come on. Mama. Honey, she's 11 months old. It's too early, isn't it? I had met you back at the park, coffee for us in my hands. We were surrounded by other young families doting on their kids, looking various stages of cold and tired. I smiled at a mom who was standing nearby clutching a snotty tissue. I mean, I spend every day with her, she's never said it before. Mama, you prompted her again. Mama. Violet pouted and ambled toward the swings. I can't believe you missed it. Right when you left for the coffee. She pointed in your direction and said Mama. Mama. 3 times, I think, actually. Oh. Okay, well that's amazing. Wow. It didn't seem like something you'd lie about, but it was hard to believe. You lifted her into the baby swing. I wish I'd caught it on video. I wish you heard it. You shook your head and watched her in awe, your baby genius, rocking in her seat so you'd push her higher. I gave you your coffee and slipped my hand in the back pocket of your jeans like I used to do. We felt so normal among the other young families like ours, killing time on Sunday morning, savoring the caffeine. "Mama, did you hear that?" You jumped back from the swing. "Oh my God. I heard it." "Say it again." "Mama." I spilled my coffee, lumbering toward her in the playground sand. I grabbed the front of the swing and pulled her close to kiss her square on her wet lips. "Yes, Mama," I said to her. "That's me. Mama, I told you." You squeezed my shoulders from behind and we stared at her as I pretended to tickle her feet when the swing came toward us. She was laughing then, saying my name over and over to watch our reactions. I was mesmerized by her. We swayed ever so slightly together, and I reached up to feel the weekend scruff on your chin. You turned my face toward you and kissed me, brief, happy, carefree. Violet watched us. We stood like that for what felt like hours. She fell asleep in the stroller on the way home. It had been so long since I'd felt this connected to either of you, and I clung to the bliss of it, the lightness of my legs as we walked, the satisfying depth of my long, full breath. You carried her to her crib, careful not to wake her, and I slipped her tiny boots off while she slept. I turned in the hallway toward the kitchen, to clean the mess of breakfast we'd left for later. But you tugged at my arm. You pulled me into the bathroom and ran the shower. I leaned on the counter and watched you undress. "Come in with me." I thought of the half avocado still sitting on the counter, the rubber eggs left in the pan. It had been so long since we'd touched each other. "Come on, Mama." I'd just stepped in when we heard her little voice start to crack from down the hall. She was waking up. I reached for the faucet, thinking you'd want to run for her before she cried. "Stay, we'll be quick," you whispered, already hard, and so I did. Her noises became more urgent, a reminder she was there, but you didn't stop. You'd wanted me more than her. I was repulsed with myself for the satisfaction this gave me as we fucked, for letting this turn me on as much as it did. I listened for her through the echo of the water. I wanted to hear her wail, to imagine you ignoring her like I sometimes did. We came fast together under the weak flow of the showerhead. You shut off the water abruptly as soon as we finished. She was quiet. She hadn't started screaming like I'd been waiting for, like she did when it was just me. You tossed me a towel like my teammate in a locker room you used to dry my body off slowly. It had once been part of what we did together. Violet's voice was soft in the distance, a meaningless scale of sounds, and I pictured her on her back, legs in the air, pulling at her sweaty toes. It was as though she knew you'd be there to get her soon. You wrapped another towel around your waist, kissed my bare shoulder, and you went to her. Back in the kitchen you made us grilled cheese sandwiches while I tidied up the browning scraps from breakfast. You hummed and touched me whenever I was in reach. She said it over and over again as she watched for your reaction, kicking her legs in her high chair, "Mama. Mama." 1968. Etta wasn't always unpredictable. There were stretches of time when she figured out how to look and act like the kind of person a mother was expected to be. Cecilia sensed this wasn't easy for her. She saw it sometimes in the way Etta's hands shook nervously when another mother knocked on their door to say hello, or when Cecilia asked for a braid in her hair. But nobody was scrutinizing Etta by then. The truth was they'd all given up. And yet something inside her made Etta want to try anyway. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. But Cecilia rooted for her each and every time. When Cecilia was in the 6th grade, there was a school dance after the holiday break, and she had nothing to wear. They didn't go to church and didn't celebrate much. This wasn't something Cecilia cared or complained about, but Etta said she would make her something special to wear. Cecilia was speechless. She'd never seen her mother make a thing. The next day, Etta came home from the fabric store and called up the stairs. "Cecilia, come see." She'd laid out a tissue paper pattern for a shift dress, and yards of dark yellow cotton. Cecilia stood still while Etta measured her long, skinny body, one so unlike her own. Cecilia felt like she was being touched by a stranger as her mother's hands ran along the inside of her leg, across her thin waist, and up to her shoulders. Etta wrote down the measurements on a napkin and declared that the dress would be beautiful. There was an old sewing machine left in the hall closet from the owners before them, and Etta brought it to the kitchen table. She worked on the dress in the evenings for 5 straight nights, and the old motor kept Cecilia awake until the early hours. In the morning there'd be straight pins and bits of thread spread across the kitchen table. Etta would come down, her eyes bleary, and stare at the fabric as she held it up to Cecilia. The project gave Etta a purpose that Cecilia hadn't seen her mother have before. And less room, she knew, for the anger and sadness. The morning of the dance, Etta was up early and went to Cecilia's room with the dress. It was finished, pressed and draped over her arm. She held it up to Cecilia's shoulders and ran her hands over the drop waist and pleated bottom. She trimmed the neckline and sleeves with a beautiful knotted silk. "What do you think?" "I love it." It was what Etta wanted to hear, yes, but Cecilia did in fact love it. It was the most beautiful thing she had, and the only thing anyone had ever made for her. She imagined walking into class that day and watching the heads of the other girls turn to stare in jealous disbelief. Cecilia turned her back and took off her nightgown. The zipper of the dress was stiff, but she managed to get it down and then slipped her legs in. She pulled the dress up and felt the seams rough against her skin. The waist was tight and flattened her small bum, but it wouldn't go any higher. She wiggled the dress around herself and tried to yank harder. But the dress wouldn't move. "Put your arms in. Go on." She tried to crouch into the dress and slither her arms into the sleeves, but it was too tight. They heard the sound of fabric tearing. "Come here." Etta yanked her closer and pulled and tugged around her like she was dressing a doll. She whipped the dress down Cecilia's legs and then tried pulling it over her head. Etta didn't say a word. Cecilia let her wrangle the dress and jostle her however she wanted to. Etta's forehead was slick with sweat and her face had turned a deeper red than usual. Cecilia closed her eyes as tight as she could. Eventually Etta let her go and stood up. "You're wearing the dress, Cecilia." Her heart sank. She couldn't possibly wear it. She couldn't even get it on. 15 minutes later, Cecilia came down to the kitchen wearing her usual beige slacks and blue turtleneck. She didn't look at Etta. She sat at the table and picked up her spoon. "Go back and put the dress on." "You saw. It doesn't fit." Cecilia's heart pounded. "Make it fit. Go upstairs. Now." She wondered if Henry might hear her. She put her spoon down and tried to decide what to do. "Now." Cecilia could hear Etta's thick breathing behind her. She could feel Etta's rage tickling her spine. She listened for Henry's footsteps, hoping he'd hurry up and come down. "Now." For the first time then, Cecilia realized she had a kind of power over Etta. She could make her angry. She could make her lose control. She could have gone upstairs and pretended to try again, but she wanted to see how far Etta would go if she ignored her. They were trading gunfire. "Now, Cecilia." Etta was shaking and she screamed again. "Now! Now!" Every time she screamed, the rage seemed to pump through her like a drug and Cecilia could see the shame in her face as the high wore off. Cecilia would come to know that feeling herself many years later. Henry came into the kitchen just as Etta's mouth opened again. Somehow, she found a way to calm down and she poured him a coffee. Cecilia ran out the door without the dress. She waited until dark to go home that night, when she knew Henry would be there. Etta didn't look at her. She went upstairs and saw that Etta must have taken the dress from her room. A few minutes later Etta walked to Cecilia's door, the yellow fabric folded in her hands. She sat on Cecilia's bed and held up the dress. She'd taken it apart and sewn extra panels in the sides. It looked boxy and crooked, but she had tried. "You can save it for the next dance." Cecilia took it from her and ran her fingers over the knotted trim, and then she hugged her. Etta stiffened in her arms. A few months later she wore the dress to the school's end-of-year dance. She sat awkwardly on the edge of the gym stage, trying to hide just how badly it fit. Cecilia didn't change when she got home. She wore the dress to dinner. Her mother didn't mention it, and neither did Henry, and Cecilia didn't wear the dress again. Chapter 21. The party was more for us than it was for her. A whole year of parenthood. I ordered a huge bouquet of balloons in pastel colors with a giant foil one in the middle and bought fancy paper plates that were scalloped around the edges. The straws were polka-dotted. Your mother gave Violet a beautiful corduroy jumper the color of butter and ribbed tights with ruffles on the bum. She looked like a baby duckling, waddling around the living room, her pink, wet lips blowing spit bubbles as she babbled to her guests. Your father followed her, crouched on his bad knees, recording her every move. I bought the cake from the bakery where I often took her for a treat on our walks. Vanilla cream icing with rainbow sprinkles on top. She squealed and clapped when I placed it on her high chair tray, her eyes locked on the single tiny flame. "Happy," she said. "As clear as day." "I got that on film," said your doting dad, holding up his digital camera. Your mother smothered her in kisses, and your sister, whom we rarely saw but who had flown 5 hours to be there, scrunched up tissue paper to make her laugh. Grace, who brought a bottle of tequila with her, cut and served the cake. We watched them all together from the comfy living room chair, me on your lap, your arms folded across my chest. "We did it," you whispered, and breathed me in slowly, your nose tickling the nape of my neck. I nodded and took a sip of your beer. Violet looked angelic in her high chair, her rapt audience, the icing smeared across her face. I felt your nose on my neck again. I took another drink and pulled you up. "Let's get a family picture." We stood in the natural light from our apartment windows and I held Violet on my hip between us. She felt unusually docile, and I pulled her in for a kiss on her sugary cheek. We smiled as they clicked away. You made her giggle with your duck noises. I held her above our heads as we squealed at one another with wide open mouths. The three of us, exactly as we were supposed to be. Chapter 22. Very soon after her first birthday, Violet stopped sleeping through the night again. You never heard her right away, and sometimes not at all, but it felt like my eyes opened a few seconds before she made her first noise from the crib down the hall. This unnerved me every time, the reminder that she was still so much a physical part of me. Every 2 hours she cried for her bottle. After a few weeks, I lined up 6 of them, full of milk, against the railing of her crib, hoping she'd find one when she wanted it. She never did. "I can't do this," I'd think every time she woke me up. "I won't survive this again." I would open the door of her nursery, put a bottle in her hand, and leave. Isn't that bad for bacteria, having all that milk sitting out? Isn't that dangerous, you asked when you realized what I was doing? I don't know. It probably was, but I didn't care. I just needed her to go back to sleep. This went on for months and left me ravaged. I woke in the morning with a headache that sat behind my eyes and made my thoughts come slower. I avoided having to speak with other adults for fear I'd make no sense. My resentment of you both festered. I hated hearing you breathe deeply and evenly when I came back to bed, and I sometimes tugged at the sheets in the hopes it would rouse you from the place I so badly wanted to be. I brought up the idea of sending Violet to daycare a few days a week. You'd said early on, before Violet was even born, that you didn't like the idea of daycare. Your mother had raised her children at home until they were 5 and went to school. You wanted the same for your own. I had agreed, blindly, heartily. I would do the things you thought perfect mothers did. But that was before. I found a place 3 blocks away that had a spot open up for the fall. I'd overheard people rave about it, and they had a camera in the room that let parents watch remotely. The truth was, I often felt sad for those daycare babies when I saw them lined up like eggs in a carton in those long strollers, tired underpaid staff pushing them around the city for something to do. But there was research about babies in daycare environments better socialized, more stimulated, accelerated development, etc., etc. I sent you the articles every so often. At dinner I'd follow up delicately to emphasize the internal conflict you wanted me to have. Maybe Violet needed more stimulation now. Maybe it's time. Although perhaps she's better off at home. For naps and such. What do you think? I'd ask to feign concern, but we both knew the answer I needed. Wait to decide once she's sleeping better, you'd reasoned. You're just tired right now. I know it's hard, but this will pass. You had the nerve to say this as you dressed for work, your face bright, your hair freshly cut. I had listened to you sing in the shower that morning. I was miserable. She and I both were, it seemed. She was gravely unhappy when she was around only me. She wouldn't let me hold her anymore. She didn't want me near her. Most days she was irritable and troublesome when we were alone and nothing could soothe her. She screamed so loudly when I picked her up that I could imagine the neighbors next door stopping dead in their tracks. When we were in public, at the grocery store or the park, other mothers would sometimes ask in a sympathetic voice if there was anything they could do to help. I was humiliated they pitied me either for having given birth to a child like Violet or for being the kind of mother who looked too weak to survive her. We began staying home mostly, although I lied about this when you returned from work asking for a daily report as she eagerly climbed onto your lap. Confined to our apartment, she would scamper around like a scorpion, looking for things to shovel into her mouth, fistfuls of plant dirt, the keys from my purse, even stuffing she'd somehow pull from our pillows. She nearly choked herself blue sometimes. When I scooped her mouth clean, she would flail like a fish out of water and then go limp. Like she was dead. My heart would stop. Her eyes would go wide, and then would come a scream from deep within her, so repellent that it made my eyes sting with tears. I was so disappointed she was mine. I knew some of her behavior could be classified as typical. You wrote it off as being just a phase, toddler crankiness, the symptoms of a developmental leap. Fair enough, I tried to convince myself. But she was missing the inherent sweetness of other children her age. She so rarely showed affection. She didn't seem happy not anymore. I saw a sharpness inside her that sometimes looked physically painful. I could see it in her face. We joked about toddler life with other people who had kids, as parents do, looking for reassurance. We would commiserate with the tables beside us as we all raced through early bird dinners at restaurants with sticky high chairs. I would downplay how bad she could be, knowing you wanted me to. I would agree, as I was supposed to, that the moments in between the chaos made up for all the rest. But she was cyclonic. And I was increasingly scared of her. I desperately wanted more time to myself. I wanted a break from her. These seemed like reasonable requests to me, but you made me feel like I still had to prove myself to you. Your lingering doubt, although it was silent, was so heavy that sometimes it was hard to breathe around you. I could write only when she was asleep, but she never napped long, and so we'd fallen back into our secret routine, as much as I promised myself I wouldn't do that to her again. I let it happen only a few days a week. And I always tried to make it up to her: a cookie on our afternoon walk, a nice long bath time. I knew these days were numbered. She would soon be able to talk, to tell you what happened in her day, and then I would lose this power I so shamefully held. Perhaps this was part of my justification. My behavior was pathological. but I couldn't stop punishing her for being there. How easy it was to slip on my headphones and pretend she did not exist. One day was particularly tough. She became angry every time I went near her, kicking and slapping. She slammed her head against the wall and then looked at me to see what I would do. And then she did it again. She hadn't eaten all day. I knew she was starving, but she wouldn't let food cross her lips because it was me who was offering. I had spent the entirety of her nap crying, looking up early signs of behavioral disorders on the internet and then deleting the history from the browser. I didn't want you to see it, and I didn't want to be a mother with that kind of child. She gave up the fight mere minutes before you came home, as though she could hear your feet step off the elevator. I placed her on my hip while I cleaned the living room. She was stiff. Quiet. She smelled a little stale. Her sleeper was rough against my arm, the cotton pilled from too many washes. I handed her to you, still in your nice office sweater. I explained how she got the red welt on her head. I didn't care if you believed me or not. Honey. You tried to laugh to quell your judgment as you tickled her on the carpet. Is she really that bad? I thought things were getting better. I slumped on the couch. I don't know. I'm just so tired. I couldn't tell you the truth, that I believed there was something wrong with our daughter. You thought the problem was me. Here. You held her out to me. She was licking a piece of cheese you gave her. She's calm. She's fine. Just cuddle with her. Show her some love. Fox, this isn't about love. Or affection. I try that all the time. Just hold her. I put her on my lap and waited for her to shove me away, but she sat there, content, sucking on her soggy cheddar. We watched you unpack your briefcase. Dada, she said. Baba. You passed her the bottle from the coffee table and she sank back into me. I don't think you understand, I said quietly, careful not to disrupt her. Her weight on my body was comforting, and I began to calm down. I felt like someone who'd been lost at sea having human contact again. I ran my finger along her forehead, brushing back her wispy fringe. She let me kiss her. She pulled the bottle away from her mouth and sighed. We were both so tired of fighting each other. Are you napping when she naps? You spoke quietly, too, studying us. I can't nap, I snapped, the calm draining from my chest. She wiggled away from me. There's too much to do. Laundry. I'm trying to write. My mind won't stop spinning. I tossed the bottle onto the coffee table and a squirt of milk sprayed on the pages I'd printed. I was thinking of showing them to you that night. It had been so long since you asked about what I was working on. I watched the beads of milk drip from the rubber nipple onto my sentences, blotting the ink. You changed your clothes and came back and fell onto the couch beside me. Your hand patted my thigh. There was a time I would have asked about your day. The sadness of the distance that had grown between us again over the past few months was something we didn't discuss. I was willing to let it fester in the background, and it seemed you were, too. What's that? You gestured to the wet pages. Nothing. Confirm her daycare spot, if you want to. But only 3 days a week, okay? We didn't budget for this. You rubbed your forehead. I tried my best for the rest of that week. But we fell back into our daily combat. She started daycare the following Monday, and I can still feel the enormous sense of relief that washed over me when I placed her down on the welcome mat. She stared at her yellow rain boots until the teacher came to take her hand. She didn't look at me when I said goodbye, and I never turned around as I walked away across the wet lawn and out of the gate. Chapter 23. Your mother gave Violet her first doll. Maternal instinct starts young, she said as she unwrapped fresh fish from the market and gestured to Violet on the floor. Violet had the plastic-headed baby tucked under her arm and hadn't put it down since she'd gotten it. Barbie, Violet sang over and over, and poked the wide fluttering eyes that had lashes thicker than mine. The doll had an artificial scent like baby powder and was dressed in a pink sleeper. I drank my wine and watched your mother make dinner. She'd insisted on cooking cedar plank salmon with maple sauce even though I'd offered to order in. Violet brought the baby doll to me and put her on my lap. Mama. Baby. Yes, sweetie. She's cute. I rocked and kissed the doll as she watched. Your turn. She reached up, put her wide-open mouth on the baby's bald head. I hadn't seen her act this affectionately before, except with you, although I didn't want to give your mother the satisfaction of saying so. Good girl. Kisses. The smell of fish filled the apartment. Your father had taken you to the hockey game. They were staying in the city for 3 nights. A hotel. A matter of space, I had said, although we had bought a pull-out sofa just for them when we first moved in. I was still so tired even though Violet was sleeping better. I was too on edge to have your mother in our home for all that time. My feelings for her were complicated. I felt desperate for her help, anyone's help, but I had come to resent her capability, how easy she had made everything seem for your entire life. How's daycare going for our sweet girl? Good, I think. She seems to really like the teachers. She's learned so much in just a few weeks. She topped up my glass and bent to kiss Violet. And you? She asked. Me? You've been enjoying your free time? She had spent nearly 2 decades taking care of you and your sister at home. Baked pies. Ran the PTA. She had sewn every pillow, drape, napkin, placemat, and shower curtain herself. I watched her blonde bob swing as she cooked, the same length and flip she wore in every gold-framed family photograph in the hallway of your childhood home. I've been writing more and catching up on things around here. You must count down the hours until pickup. I always did, once they were in school. You want a bit of peace and quiet and then you spend all day thinking about them. She smiled to herself, chopping dill. Fox seems to be enjoying her. I always knew he'd make a wonderful dad. Even when he was little. Violet clanged the stove with a whisk, the doll's foot in her other hand. He's incredible. He's the perfect father. It was what she wanted to hear, and in some ways it was true. She smiled to herself and picked up a lemon and then watched Violet play for a moment before she grated the rind. I bent down to lift Violet and take her to the bath. She flinched when she felt my touch and I knew I had set her off. The ever-present knot in my stomach tightened. She wailed, thrashing her body against the floor tiles. Come on, honey, bath time. I didn't want to battle in front of your mother. I picked her up as she kicked and screamed and took her to the bathroom. I shut the door and ran the water. Your mother knocked a few minutes later and spoke loudly over the crying. Can I help? She's just cranky, Helen. She's tired. But she came in anyway. By then I was soaked and Violet was nearly purple with rage. I rinsed the soap from her hair with a tight grip under her arm. When I lifted her out she could barely breathe from the screaming. Your mother watched us and passed the towel. Can I take her? She'll be okay, I said and held Violet tight to restrain her. But her teeth cut into the fat of my cheek before I could move my face away. She had bitten me. I yelled from between my clenched teeth and tried to pull her head away, but she was clamped on too tightly. Your mother gasped and pulled her granddaughter's jaw apart with her fingers. She grabbed Violet from me and said only, "My God." I looked at the mark in the mirror and ran the cold water. I pressed a wet cloth onto my skin. I was humiliated. I could see your mother's face behind me, aghast. Violet had stopped screaming now. She caught her breath between her whimpers in your mother's arms and looked at her for reprieve, as though she'd been defending herself in the arms of a torturer. I'm sorry, I said. To no one. How about you take the fish out, and I'll get her pajamas on? No, it's okay. I took her from your mother, embarrassed, determined, but Violet screamed again, whipping her head back. Your mother's face was on fire. I passed Violet back to her and turned to the sink. She walked down the hall to Violet's bedroom, hushing in her ear like you always did, while I cried behind the sound of the running faucet. Thank you for dinner, Helen. It was delicious. The least I can do. I'm sorry about earlier. That was quite a scene. Sweetheart, don't worry. She lifted her wine but didn't drink. I'm sure she's just tired. Do you think she's napping enough? Maybe not. She was. We were both pretending that things weren't as bad as they were. That Violet's behavior could be easily explained. It was what people in your family preferred to do. I pushed around the last bit of food. She's in a daddy phase right now, I guess. Well, we can't blame her. She winked and cleared our plates. You're both very lucky to have him. And what about him? Isn't he lucky to have me, too? In the kitchen she poured me another glass. I was quiet. Things will get easier, she whispered. I nodded. The tears came back and I felt my face redden. She didn't speak for a moment, but when she did, she had softened, like she suddenly accepted that things were worse than she wanted to believe. She covered my hand with hers and we both watched her grip me tightly. Look. Nobody said motherhood was easy. Especially if it's not what you thought it would be, or it's not what her thin, pink lips pressed together between thoughts. She wouldn't dare to have mentioned my mother. But you figure out a way to get through. For everyone. That's what you have to do. When you walked in the door, the first thing you asked was how Violet had been. How was my girl tonight? You were beaming. You loved when your mother spent time with our daughter. She was very good, for the most part. Your mother kissed both of your cheeks and turned to get her purse. You gave me a long hug and felt tipsy in my arms. You smelled of beer and spicy processed meat in the cold. When I pulled away, you asked what was wrong with my face. You touched the red mark from Violet's teeth and I flinched. Nothing. Just a mark from Violet. I lifted my eyes toward your mother. Yes, she put up a challenge before bed, she said, speaking to you. She does have a bit of a temper, that one. You frowned and then moved on. Hung up your coat. Your mother smiled at you tightly with raised brows, as though she expected you to say more. I looked away from her, grateful for her solidarity, and ashamed that I needed it so desperately. Hang in there, honey. She said this to me quietly and then left to meet your father in the cab. Chapter 24. The vivid memories of my childhood start when I was 8 years old. I wish I didn't have to rely on these memories alone, but I do. Some people frame their perspectives of the past with worn photographs or the same stories told 1,000 times by someone who loves them. I didn't have these things. My mother didn't either, and maybe that was part of the problem. We had only one version of the truth. There is one thing that comes to me, the white lining of my stroller, the dark blue florets and an eyelet ribbon trim, and the middle of the chrome handle wrapped with cane. My mother's canary-gloved knuckles loom over me. I can't see her face looking down, just her shadow floating over me every once in a while, when she turns a corner to put the sun behind her. I can't possibly remember anything this early, I know. But I can smell sour formula and talcum powder and cigarette smoke, and I can hear the sound of the slow city buses bringing people home for dinner. I play this game in my head sometimes about Sam. What might he remember? The sharpness of the grass on the hill at the park, or the orange quilt we laid him on, 3 faces bobbing above him like umbrellas. Maybe the smell of the pumpkin muffins Violet liked to bake. The big spoon with the red handle that she always gave to him, slopping with batter. The bath toy with the spinning light you wanted to throw out. Maybe the painting in the nursery the cherub child always seemed to catch his eye in the morning. But here's what I think it would be: the tiles on the wall in the change room at the community swimming pool. I don't know why, but I think these would have become a part of him. Every week I put him on the wooden bench in the corner stall and held him still with one hand while I reached over to lock the swinging door with the other. He always looked up at the wall with searching eyes and touched the small colored squares placed in a random pattern as if they were alive. Mustard, emerald green, and a beautiful dark blue. A sailor's blue. The tiles calmed him. He made soft noises and widened his eyes as I put on his swim diaper and wrapped a towel around my still puffy waist. I looked forward to Sam seeing those tiles every time we went. They were the thing in his little world that sang to him. I go back to that change room often, looking for him in those tiles. Chapter 25. Her hair came in thick and beautiful, and people often stopped to tell us what a gorgeous little girl she was. She would smile coyly and say thank you, and for a split second I could see this tiny, remarkable, civilized person who couldn't possibly have the capacity to drag me by the ears to the edge of insanity. Those dark moments had become fewer and other parts of her personality were emerging. She was obsessed with her baby doll and brought it everywhere she went. She knew her colors by the time she was 16 months old. She insisted on wearing tights with Christmas trees under her pants for most months of the year. She ate scrambled eggs for nearly every meal and called them yellow clouds. Chipmunks scared her and squirrels thrilled her. She loved the woman from the flower shop on the corner where we went for a stem every Saturday morning. She kept the flower beside her potty to hold while she peed. She made no sense at all, and yet all the sense in the world. She gave me just enough space to hang from, to convince myself I could wrestle back onto the ledge. For a while, anyway, until I was reminded once again of where I belonged in her small but orderly world. When she was 3, after we came home from a weekend away at your friend's wedding, I had snuck into her room without taking off my coat. It was after midnight. I had wanted to smell her. I had felt an unfamiliar panic on the plane that something was wrong, that she would choke in her sleep and your mother wouldn't hear her like I would, that the carbon monoxide detectors weren't working, that the plane would hit the runway in the wrong kind of way and blow us both up. I needed her. I rarely felt this yearning for her, especially when I should have, but when I did, I couldn't remember what it was like not to want her. Who was that other mother? The one who brought me so much shame. The face of a sleeping child. She fluttered her eyes and saw me hovering above. Her lids fell down, disappointed. Her sadness was genuine. She rolled over and pulled the periwinkle duvet to her chin and looked out the dark window. I leaned to kiss her and felt her muscles tighten beneath my hand. I left the room and saw you in the hallway. I told you she was asleep. You walked in anyway and I heard smacking noises on your cheek. She told you your mother had let her watch a movie with a mermaid. She asked you to lie down with her. She had been waiting for you. I felt like I would never have with her what you had. It's all in your head, you said to me whenever I brought it up. You've created this story about the two of you, and you can't let it go. She should want me. I'm her mother. She should need me. There's nothing wrong with her. Her. There was nothing wrong with her, you said. In the morning, over breakfast, your mother recounted the lovely weekend they'd had. You beamed, being back with your daughter, bouncing her on your knee. So everything was fine. I asked your mother quietly afterward, as we filled the dishwasher together. She was an angel. She really was. She rubbed the small of my back for a moment, as if to soothe an ache she knew I carried. I think she missed you both. Chapter 26. In 3rd grade, our class spent a week making flower bouquets for our mothers, buttons glued to the inside of pink and yellow muffin cups, stems made of chenille pipe cleaners. We stuck them on thick construction paper and used our best cursive writing to copy the poem from the blackboard. Roses are red, violets are blue, you're the best mom there is, and I love you. I was the last one to finish. I couldn't remember making a craft for her before, not one as nice as this. The teacher took it from my hands and whispered to me, "It's beautiful, Blythe. She's going to love it." The teacher sent us each home with an invitation to a tea party. I threw mine in the garbage when I left school that day. I didn't want to invite my mother. Or more specifically, I didn't want to invite her in case she didn't want to come. I was 9, but I had already learned how to manage my own disappointment. On the morning of the party, as I ate breakfast alone in the kitchen while my mother slept in as usual, I rehearsed what I'd say to everyone when I got to school. My mother was ill, she had food poisoning. She couldn't come to the tea. That afternoon we decorated the classroom with tissue paper flowers before the mothers arrived. I was standing on a chair with a tack in my hand reaching for the bulletin board when I heard, "Am I early?" I nearly fell off the chair. My mother. The teacher greeted her kindly and said not to worry, she was just the first to arrive. That she was glad to see her feeling better. My mother seemed not to pick up on my lie. She looked too nervous. She waved quickly from the doorway. She was wearing something I had never seen her in before, a pretty peach suit and pearl earrings that couldn't have been real. I wasn't used to seeing her look so soft, so feminine. My heart pounded in my chest. She came. Somehow she found out and she came. She asked me to show her around the classroom while we waited for the tea to begin. I pointed out the weather station and the counter beads and the multiplication times tables. She laughed as I explained how to do it in the simplest way I could, as though she'd never seen numbers before. As the other mothers came through the door, their children running to them, my mother looked up at each woman and studied her outfit, her hair, the jewelry she wore. I sensed even then that my mother felt self-conscious, and this shocked me. She never seemed to care what the other mothers thought. She never seemed to care what anyone thought. Mrs. Ellington came in the door next and Thomas called to her. He was carefully setting up the teacups and saucers the teacher had brought from home. Mrs. Ellington waved to him, but first walked over to where I stood with my mother on the other side of the room. She held her hand out to my mother. "Cecilia, it's so nice to see you again. That color is lovely on you." My mother took her hand and then Mrs. Ellington leaned in, a sort of touch on the cheek that I'd seen other women do with each other, but never my own mother. I wondered what she smelled like to Mrs. Ellington. "You, too." My mother smiled. "And thank you for this." She lifted her chin toward the room, full of miniature tables with doilies and plates of crumpets. Mrs. Ellington brushed her hand through the air as though it were nothing. As though they liked each other. I had never heard them speak that many words to each other before. "Your mom is so pretty, Blythe," one of the girls whispered to me. "She looks like an actress," said another. I looked at my mother again and imagined what they could see, without the burden of everything I knew about her. I could tell by the way she tapped her foot that she wanted a cigarette. I wondered where her outfit had come from. Was it in her closet? Did she buy it just for today? I watched my friends watching her as they sat next to their ordinary-looking mothers. For the first time in my life I was proud of her. She looked special. She was trying. For me. The teacher handed out the flowers we'd made and the women fawned over our hard work. I held mine out to my mother and she read the poem under her breath. I'd never said anything like those words to her before. We both knew she wasn't the best mother. We both knew she wasn't even close. "Do you like it?" "I do. Thank you." She looked away and placed it on the table. "I'll have some water." "Blythe, can you pour me some?" But I wanted her to feel like a better mother than she was. I needed her to be a better mother than she was. I picked up the poem again and read it to her aloud, my voice shaking against the noise in the room. Roses are red, violets are blue. You're the best mom there. As I paused and swallowed, and I love you. She didn't lift her eyes from the poem. She took it back from my hands. 5 more minutes, class. I'll see you at home, all right? She touched the top of my head, picked up her purse, and left. I saw Mrs. Ellington's eyes follow her out of the room. My mother made shepherd's pie for dinner and still had on the peach suit when I got home. My father pulled his chair out and declared he was starving. So? Tell me all about the Mother's Day tea. Mashed potatoes thumped onto his plate and my mother didn't say a word. He turned to me and lifted his eyebrows. How was it, Blythe? Good. I sipped my milk. She slid the hot casserole dish onto the table, straight from the oven, and dropped a spoon beside it. Jesus, the wood. My father jumped up to grab a kitchen towel and burned his fingers, lifting up the edge of the casserole dish to slip it underneath. He glared at my mother, but she didn't seem to notice. I made Mom some flowers out of paper. That's nice. Where is it, Cecilia? He filled his mouth with potatoes and turned to her. Let me see. My mother looked up from the sink. Where's what? The thing she made you. For Mother's Day. My mother shook her head, confused, as though I'd never given her anything. I don't know where I put it. It must be somewhere. Check your purse. No, I don't know where it is. She looked at me and shook her head again. I don't know what happened to it. She lit a cigarette and turned on the tap to fill the sink for the dishes. She never ate with us. I never saw her eat at all. My heart sank. It had been too much. I'd said too much. Never mind, Dad. No. No, if you made your mother something nice, we'll find it. We'll put it on the fridge. Seb? Go find it, Cecilia. She threw the dishcloth at his face. The smack made me jump and I dropped my fork on the floor. My father sat there with the wet cloth hanging from him, his eyes closed. He put down his knife and fork and squeezed his fists so his knuckles were the color of the potatoes. I wanted him to yell with the same rage that brewed inside of her constantly. He was so still that I wondered if he was still breathing. I went, didn't I? To the fucking tea. I was there. I sat at the little table and played along. What more do you want from me? She grabbed her cigarettes and left for the porch. My father took the cloth off his head and folded it on the table. He picked up his fork and looked at me. Eat. Chapter 27. The spring after Violet turned 4, her preschool teacher asked us for a meeting after school on a Friday. Nothing of major concern, she'd said on the phone, emphasizing the major. But we should talk. You were skeptical from the start, although I knew a part of you was nervous about what she would say. What, she won't share the glue stick? We sat on tiny chairs and your knees nearly hit your chin. She offered us water in pink plastic cups that tasted like dish soap. Everyone knows you open with the good news. Violet is an exceptionally bright child. She's mature for her age in many ways. She's very astute. But there were incidents that had caused her classmates to be uncomfortable with her. She gave us the example of a boy who was scared to sit near her because she sometimes twisted his fingers until he cried. A girl who said Violet stabbed her thigh with a pencil. And that morning, during recess, someone said Violet pulled down their pants and threw handfuls of rocks in their underwear. My face grew hot and I covered my neck, sure it was blotching. I was embarrassed that we'd created a human being who would act this way. I glanced out the window to the playground covered with small, dusty pebbles. I thought of the aggression she'd shown when she was younger. Of what little empathy I saw in her now. I could easily see her doing it all. She's apologetic when told to be, yes, the teacher said hesitantly when you asked her. She's smart. She knows her behavior is hurtful, but this hasn't seemed to deter her like we'd expect. At this point, I think we need to introduce consequences. We agreed on the strategy and thanked her for the meeting. Look, it's not good, but every kid goes through this kind of thing. Testing the boundaries. She's probably bored in there. Did you see all that plastic shit lying around? It looked like a room for babies. Remind me how much we're paying them. I watched the bubbles dance up the side of your glass. We'd gone for a drink, my suggestion. I thought it might ease the tension between us. We'll talk to her, you rationalize to yourself. Something's obviously provoking her to act this way. I nodded. Your reaction made no sense to me. You were such a sensible person in every respect. And yet when it came to our daughter, you lost all your level-headedness. You defended her blindly. You're not going to say anything. You were angry. I'm upset. I'm disappointed. And yes, we'll talk to her. But I can't say I'm surprised. You shook your head. Here she goes. Other kids her age would act out by biting or hitting or saying, "You're not coming to my birthday party anymore." What she's doing sounds kind of cruel. Kind of calculated. I put my head into my hands. She's 4, Blythe. She can't even tie her shoes. Look, I love her, I'm just saying. Do you? How good that must have felt. It was the first time you'd said it aloud, but I knew you'd been thinking it for years. You stared at the ring-stained bar top. I love her, Fox. I'm not the problem. I thought of how carefully the teacher had chosen her words. I walked home alone and gave the babysitter money for her taxi. Violet was fast asleep. I slipped into her twin bed and pulled the duvet over my legs and held my breath when she stirred. She wouldn't have wanted me in there, but it's where I so often found myself. I was trying to find something in her stillness. I don't know what. Maybe the raw, sweet smell of her when she slept reminded me of where she came from. She was not perfect, she was not easy, but she was my daughter and maybe I owed her more. And yet, as I lay there in the dark, I felt a twinge of vindication thinking about the meeting. I'd been living with a terrifying, unrelenting suspicion about my daughter, and I sensed that someone else could finally see it, too. Chapter 28. Sometime in the weeks that followed, I went to a gallery downtown after I dropped Violet off at school. There was a controversial exhibit that had been reviewed in the newspaper the day before, and I watched you read it over your morning coffee. Ever so slightly you had shaken your head before you turned the page. I took one step inside the gallery and stared at the walls. On the matte white paint hung portraits used in media coverage of children who had been accused of gun violence. Unthinkable, sometimes deadly violence. Children, some barely old enough for acne, barely large enough to ride a roller coaster. I thought of how tiny those boys' genitals would have been, how juvenile they were, hairless, sexless. 2 of the children were girls. Each smiled widely, intensely, lips nearly curled under. One had braces. She would have gone with her mother to the orthodontist every month for an adjustment, picked out which color bands she wanted for her wires. Asked for strawberry ice cream after, because anything else in her mouth hurt too much. For hours the children watched me. Could they recognize me as the kind of person they came from? Someone like their own mother? An employee with short, side-swept hair barely looked up from reading art catalogs at the lumbering oak desk in the corner. I touched the glass covering one young girl's school portrait. A perfect braid hung over each shoulder. Where does it begin? When do we know? What makes them turn? Who is to blame? On the walk home, I talked myself through how irrational it was to think I'd find something familiar in those portraits. Going there was an absolutely mad thing to do. I picked her up early from school that day and we went for hot chocolate and cookies. She offered me half of her cookie when we sat down. "I think you're a very kind girl," I said. She licked the chocolate chips of her half while she thought about this. "Noah said I'm mean. But I don't like Noah anyway." "Noah doesn't know you very well, then." She nodded and stirred the marshmallow goo with her finger. We skipped dinner. The cookies had ruined our appetites. In the bath she closed her eyes and floated over a layer of bubbles like an angel in the snow. "I'm going to hurt Noah tomorrow." Her words stopped my heart. I wrung the facecloth and hung it on the tap, careful to measure my reaction. She wanted a reaction. "That wouldn't be nice, Violet," I said calmly. "We don't hurt people. Instead, why don't you tell him one thing you really like about him? Does he share nicely? Is he fun to play with at recess?" "No," she said and put her head under the water. "The next day I told you I had an appointment and asked you to pick her up at school. Instead I circled the grocery store and bought nothing." My heart raced as I got closer to home. I'd been looking at my phone all day, sure the teacher would have called. "How was she?" I was nearly out of breath. "They said she had a really good day." You ruffled Violet's hair while she twirled her spaghetti. She looked up at me and sucked a strand through the gap in her front teeth. Later, before I went to bed, as I collected her clothes for the washing machine, I found a huge fistful of curly blonde hair in the pocket of the dress she had worn to school that day. I stared at it in my hand. The feeling of holding another human's hair in my palm was unsettling. And then I realized whose hair this was. Small, shy, pale little Noah with his head of messy curls. I walked down the hall unsure of what to do with it. "Fox, I have something for you," you'd called from the living room. Your voice was higher than it usually was. I closed my fist around the hair. You were sitting on the couch and handed me a small square box. And then I remembered you'd had your annual review that day. You'd been promoted. You'd been given a huge raise. "You do so much for us," you said, your nose to my forehead. I opened the box. Inside was a thin gold chain with a small pendant engraved with the letter V. I lifted it up and held it against my neck. "Things aren't so easy right now, but I love you. You know that, right?" You slipped off my shirt. You told me you wanted me. The hair sat in the pocket of my jeans on the floor, and when we were done, I flushed the nest of blonde hair down the toilet. In the morning on the way to school I asked Violet what had happened to Noah the day before. "He cut off all his own hair." "He cut it himself?" "Yes. In the bathroom." "What did the teacher say?" "I dunno." "You had nothing to do with it?" "No." "Are you lying to me?" "No. I promise." She was quiet while we walked another block and then she said, "I helped him clean up, so that's why his hair was in my pocket." When we walked into the playground that morning, Noah looked at Violet and ran back to his mother and buried his face in her legs. His head had been buzzed clean. Violet walked right past him and through the front doors. His mother bent down to ask him what was wrong. "Nothing," I heard him whine. She held a tissue at his nose and told him to blow. I gave her a look of sympathy and smiled. She looked tired. She did her best to smile back and waved, the dirty tissue in her hand. I should have walked over to say, "I know the feeling. Some days are hard." But my knees were weak, and I needed to get out of there. On the way home, I thought of the photographs hanging in the gallery from the day before. The women behind those children. But her mother was so normal. She was just like one of us. After school that same day, I came up from doing the laundry and found her standing on the edge of a chair at the kitchen counter, her little fingers dancing leisurely through the pickle juice. "What are you doing?" I had asked. "Fishing for whales," she had said. I looked over her shoulder and watched her try to catch the last few watered pickles as they gracefully breached and dove in a jar of soggy dillweed, and you know what? They did look just like whales. She had a brilliant, beautiful mind, and sometimes I longed to be inside it. Even though I feared what I might find.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to receive notifications about new books. Thank